Good morning. My name is Neil Kashkari, and I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. On behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, welcome to our conference. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is the 9th Federal Reserve Bank. We represent the 9th Federal Reserve District, which is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Northwestern Wisconsin. A big part of our jobs are to understand what is happening in our regional economy and then bring that information back to Washington, D.C. for our Federal Open Market Committee meetings where we set interest rates for the nation. Now, typically we do that a couple of ways. One way is we go and we travel around the region. I, before COVID, would spend a lot of my time traveling around the region, meeting with businesses, meeting with workers, meeting with local leaders to understand the local economic conditions. This is a very big region. It's a diverse region, economically speaking, different sectors. We work really hard with my colleagues getting out across the district. Another thing we started to do several years ago was bringing experts to the bank. And so this Regional Economic Conditions Conference is meant to be an annual event where we have economic and policymaking experts from each of the states in our district who come to the Minneapolis Fed to share their outlook for their state's economy. That is both to help all policymakers who are interested in the regional economy learn from those experts, but selfishly, it's really also meant to help us get the latest thinking from experts in each of these states' economy, and it helps focus our attention over the upcoming year on where we should be spending more time studying different events. Again, this is a very large region geographically, but it's also a very large and complex region in terms of all of the various major sectors that are represented here. And so we've had great success with this conference over the last several years. We've really learned a lot. And now in the time of COVID, where traveling is obviously more difficult, I'm not traveling right now. I haven't been since March. It's even more important that we get to hear from experts. And now with these technologies like Zoom, it's easier to connect to people and it's easier to spread what we're learning out across the country. We have more than 20 partners who've joined with us today to promote this event, to get the message out. We've got a great attendance for this. I want to thank our partners. All of them are listed on the Minneapolis Fed's website. A few other housekeeping notes. You're going to get a survey at the end of this event for feedback on what you found useful. It'll help us make events even better in the future. So we'd appreciate it if you would fill out that survey. And all of this information and all of these videos are being not only live streamed right now, but they're being archived. So if you're interested in going back and hearing from some of our great speakers, this will all be available on our website. And I would encourage you to do that. Lastly, we have a terrific keynote speaker later this morning. We'll introduce him a little later, but it's the governor of North Dakota, Governor Burgum, who is both the governor, but he's also a business executive from his private sector career. I'm really looking forward to hearing from him and having a conversation with the governor later on this morning. So thank you again for being here. On behalf of all of my colleagues at the Minneapolis Fed, I want to thank our terrific speakers for being here with us. And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Joe Mann, who's going to introduce the first panel.
Well, thank you, Neil, for introducing our event this morning. And thank you to everyone in our audience who's tuning in from across our region today. We're really excited to be able to really do this interactively across the 9th District. I'm going to be moderating our first panel with our first three state economists, and I'll be introducing the first in a moment. Just a couple quick, once again, housekeeping items before we get going. Each speaker in our first panel is going to speak for about 20 minutes. We're going to hold Q&A after all three panelists present. So any time remaining that they leave, we'll just continue to push on to the end, and that'll give us more time for discussion at the end. We do encourage our audience members to submit questions. If we were having this conference in person, we would have mic runners out in the audience taking live questions from the audience. Of course, that's more challenging with a virtual event with hundreds of people. So we're asking you to submit your questions for our panelists in the chat box on the feature. If it doesn't show up in the chat, don't worry. We the presenters will be able to see those questions, and I will be able to refer to them during the Q&A session at the end of our panel. And as Neil mentioned, there will be some follow-up after the event. Anyone interested, if you're not able to attend all of today's presentation, I can assure you we are broadcasting this live on YouTube and we are recording it, so the video will be available after the event. You'll get a follow-up email in about a week or so when that video is available, and we'll also make available copies of the presenters' slides. I know they might be hard to view at times in the Zoom webinar. So you will be able to have those on our website to go back and reference later. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker this morning. We're very pleased to have Oriane Casal, who is the Interim Director of the Labor Market Information Office at Minnesota's Department of Employment and Economic Development. While she's originally from the East Coast, where she attended the New School for Social Research for her undergraduate degree, she moved to Minnesota 25 years ago to attend the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. And she's been working for the state of Minnesota, mostly in the Labor Market Information Office since then. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Oriane, who I see has her slides up already. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Joe. So this presentation focuses on Minnesota's labor market conditions during the pandemic recession. I'll start with an overview of job trends by industry and then move to worker impacts and worker responses. There we go. Minnesota lost almost 388,000 jobs in March and April, and then gained jobs from May through October. November was the first month that we lost ground since April. The combined effects of increasing infection rates that kept people home and an early snowstorm that hit construction hard left us 12,600 jobs below October's employment level on a seasonally adjusted basis. Losses in November were in leisure and hospitality, manufacturing, construction, and trade, transportation, and utilities. Although I don't generally like to make predictions, November's backsliding in employment is likely to continue into December. This is because the reference week for the survey fell during the temporary restrictions on arts, entertainment, and recreation and indoor seating in restaurants that was implemented in the second half of November. And you'll recall infection rates were particularly high that month in Minnesota. This graph that I have up shows Minnesota payroll employment trends from the first to the last month of each of the last 5 recessions listed down here, as well as the current recession. The deep V shape that you see, this is the current pandemic recession, stands out compared to all other recessions, including the Great Recession, which is this V, much shallower V here. And, you know, during the Great Recession, we got down to over the year job loss rate of 5%, whereas we saw a 13.1% loss in April. Looking at these comparisons, Minnesota took 29 months to rebuild back to our pre-recession level of employment after the Great Recession, so this period of time here. Our current third quarter 2020 employment forecasts in Minnesota put us back to our pre-recession employment level at the end of 2022 or beginning of 2023, about 33 months, so someplace out here. Oh, let's see, there we go. Minnesota, so Minnesota lost almost 388,000 payroll jobs from February to April, and has since regained 193,000, or almost half of those non-farm payroll jobs, with the private sector regaining almost 55%. So that's these 2 bars here. The industry sectors on this graph are sorted by greatest to smallest job loss between February and April 2020. Arts, entertainment, and recreation has regained nearly about 30% of the jobs lost during those first few months. So that's the green bar. Accommodations and food services has regained just over half. That's this down here. And other services has regained about 64% of the jobs that were lost during that period. Finance and insurance is the only industry sector that surpassed February's seasonally adjusted employment level by just 600 jobs. You can see the small green bar going in the other direction. This graph shows how different this graph also shows how different the Great Recession was in terms of what industries were impacted versus the pandemic recession. The gray bars show that construction, manufacturing, administrative and support, particularly in temp help, wholesale trade, finance and insurance, and professional, scientific and technical services were all hit harder during the Great Recession. So these industries down here than the industries that were impacted most during this current recession. This slide looks at job churn during the pandemic recession compared to 2019, basically decomposing net job loss during second quarter 2020. So this slide only is data using, this is only second quarter 2020 data. We're going to continue this analysis as more quarters become available. The number of jobs lost in contracting firms, that's this green here, and closing, purple, business establishments far outnumbered what we usually see over here. While the number of jobs added, green, and in opening, the green bar, and expanding establishments was depressed from normal levels during second quarter. Overall, this resulted in a loss of 410,700 jobs. That's this blue bar. So basically this plus this is the impact of the recession. Looking at business closures, 10,500 jobs, establishments, 10,500 establishments closed during second quarter. So meaning that they had zero employment during this period. And another 900 did not open when compared to what we would have expected in 2019. So in total, this 11,400 establishments represents about 6.2% of our establishments in the state. So now moving to, well, I could actually add to that and just also mention that the closures, you know, of course, what we saw were the closures were in the industries hardest hit by job losses, but they were actually a little bit flipped. So other services, accommodations and food services, retail trade, and then healthcare and social assistance in that order down here were the ones hardest hit by, specifically by firm closures. So moving to unemployment, Minnesota's unemployment rate is remarkably low at just 4.4% in November, considering that it spiked at 9.9% in May. We're currently in 7th place for lowest unemployment rate nationwide. But rates vary greatly by demographic group, with Black Minnesotans experiencing a peak rate of 16.5%, which has now fallen to 11.1% using 6-month moving averages. Women saw a peak unemployment rate of 8.3%, now down to 6.4%. Equally concerning, considering our extremely tight labor market prior to March, is the decline in labor force participation. Since last November, 89,000 workers have dropped out of Minnesota's labor force. By demographic, men on the green line, Black workers, the blue line, have seen declines, while women, the black line, white workers, the gray line, and Hispanic workers, the red line, have seen increases since last November. So let's just look at women for a minute, because we do get a lot of questions on whether women are dropping out of the labor force to care for children. More women, in fact, are in Minnesota's labor force now than in November 2019. But the increase has been entirely in those who are looking for work, while the number of employed women has dropped. So this counterintuitive pattern of increasing labor force participation for women during recessions is not new in Minnesota. We saw this pattern during the Great Recession as well. But of course, the Great Recession hit male-dominated industries much harder, while this recession is hitting female-dominated industries much harder. So it is a little bit of a counterintuitive finding. One note here, though, is that Minnesota made a point of supporting the childcare industry through this pandemic period. And the last set of data I saw showed that we had not seen any decline in the number of providers, despite the very challenging conditions that this industry is facing, which may have helped make work a viable option for more women. By region, unemployment rates in the Twin Cities, here, central and southern Minnesota, so this area right here, have risen the most during the pandemic recession compared to 2019. But these regions also tend to have very low unemployment rates. And as a result, the rates remain relatively low compared to, for example, Northeast and Northwest Minnesota, which tend to have higher rates at this time of year. This inset map shows the 50 zip codes with the highest number of continued claims in Minnesota in December. As you can see, the Twin Cities, specifically the east side of St. Paul, North and South Minneapolis, Burnsville, and Anoka, have been hit hard, along with Rochester down here in southern Minnesota, Mankato, St. Cloud, Brainerd, and Bemidji. Another analysis that we developed recently uses unemployment insurance program data to assess workers' risks for long-term unemployment. This analysis is based on the 678,000 workers who filed eligible claims for unemployment insurance between March and August of last year, so of 2020. The dashboard includes analysis by demographic, region, occupation, industry, and employment characteristics. Comparing the percent of total claims here and the percent of percent in the labor force gives you an idea of how over or underrepresented that demographic group is in unemployment insurance, as in unemployment insurance claims. For example, you can see that almost twice as many Black Minnesotans have been on UI during this period as their share of the labor force would indicate. 10.5% versus 5.9%. The analysis also provides the average number of weeks each group has claimed unemployment insurance during this period, the share that, that continued to file a claim after October 3rd, and the share that coded themselves as permanently separated from their employer. As you can see, women, Black Minnesotans, Minnesotans age 65 and above, those with a high school diploma or less, these two categories, Minnesotans with a disability, and workers living in the Twin Cities metro area were the most likely to be on UI during this period, based on these two first columns, saw longer spells on unemployment insurance than other groups, and were more likely to have filed a claim after October 3rd, so showing that they remained on unemployment insurance for longer. The group experiencing the highest share of permanent layoffs vary a bit more. Having said this, very few workers are coding themselves as having been permanently laid off during this pandemic recession, only 6.8% overall, compared to between 60 and 65% during the Great Recession. This recession is a very different experience for many people. Unsurprisingly, based on the industries that have lost the most jobs, workers earning below $14.70 an hour, this group here, and part-time workers, so this analysis down here, this breakout, have been most impacted by layoffs. By broad occupational group, food, prep, and serving workers have been the most impacted. The list of the top 8 occupations with claims illustrates this, and also includes jobs in transportation and entertainment. Hopefully this presentation has been another reminder that workers have not been impacted equally in the pandemic recession. In general, those who work in low-wage sectors have been the most impacted by job losses, and those who work in the service sector have been the most susceptible to virus exposure. And there's a lot of overlap between these two groups. A recent study out of NYU's School of Global Public Health shows that the high rates of hospitalization and death among Black and Hispanic Americans are explained by higher rates of exposure on the job and at home rather than worse health outcomes. As infection rates continue to remain high and job growth continues at an uneven pace among industries, low-wage service sector workers, who are disproportionately people of color and women, are likely to continue to suffer disproportionate impacts of both the pandemic and the recession in Minnesota and around the country. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Orianne. That was a lot of very interesting content, and I know our audience is very interested in it well, because we've received a number of questions already, which, as I mentioned at the outset, we are going to hold to the end after our three panelists have all had a chance to present their content. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next panelist, who is Tessa Conroy. Tessa is an assistant professor and economic development specialist at the University of Wisconsin. In her research, she focuses on community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. And much of her work directly analyzes challenges and opportunities facing the Wisconsin economy. And once we get Tessa's slides up, I will turn it over to her. Thank you very much.
All right, are we seeing my slides this morning? I think we should be ready.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks, Joe, for the introduction. And thank you all for your time this morning. It's great to be here and be part of the conversation. I'll be sharing the economic impacts of COVID-19 from a Wisconsin perspective. So I'm going to talk about job loss, of course. We'll look at the sectoral impacts or impacts by industry. We'll also look at unemployment filings in the state. And then with the emphasis on workers today, I wanted to think more about the people who work for themselves, the self-employed. So we'll spend some time this morning also looking more closely at self-employment. So first, I want to look at the employment level in Wisconsin. So I'm showing you total non-farm employment. Wisconsin is in red, and I will clear back to the Great Recession just so that we can compare how employment has changed during the pandemic. So what you see is about 10 years of job growth from 2009 to 2019. We see the jobs recovery, and then very abruptly in April in the pandemic, we lost a large amount of jobs. In fact, in 1 month, we lost a decade's worth of job growth. We dropped actually below where we were during the trough of the recession in January 2010. The good news is that a lot of those jobs have come back. We've gotten about 55% of those jobs back. But when we look at the more recent months of data, it seems that the recovery has slowed down, that we've stopped gaining jobs back at the same rate that we were. If we compare that to what's happening to the country as a whole, that's in the orange dotted line, and we'll be using the axis on the right-hand side. You see a similar pattern, robust jobs recovery, and then a very rapid decline in April. I would say in comparison, the decline isn't as dramatic as what we saw in Wisconsin, and the country as a whole has done a bit better in terms of getting jobs back, about 60% of jobs back with the most recent data. But again, slowing down in the most recent months. I want to highlight the sectors that suffered the most job loss in April of 2020. So what I'm showing here is a change in employment from February 2020, looking first at April and then again at November. So in black, we have the job losses as of April, and these are the sectors that lost more than 25,000 jobs. Most severe losses were in the accommodation and food services sector, followed by healthcare and social assistance. So I think important to keep in mind, in Wisconsin, we had hospitals that were reducing services in anticipation of a COVID spike. Some of those spikes didn't come like we thought, so there was this overall reduction in need for labor in those institutions, as well as the childcare sector is here. So losses accumulating across different parts of the economy, of course. Followed by retail trade, manufacturing, other services. That's where we would see perhaps barbers, hairstylists, and these types of workers, on down to arts, entertainment, and recreation. At the bottom of the black line, I'm showing, though we're thinking about the level of job loss or the total number of jobs, but now we want to think about how does that job loss compare to the overall size of the sector. And the two sectors that lost the largest share of overall jobs are accommodation and food services on the far left, and then arts, entertainment, and recreation on the far right, so upwards of 60%, close to 60% of jobs lost. And again, just keeping in mind the number of people here, those two sectors combined, that's almost 160,000 jobs. Our football stadium is empty right now, but that's enough people to fill it twice. These people that lost their jobs fairly abruptly in April. Another way to think about job loss is by looking at the initial unemployment claims. In Wisconsin, you see a similar pattern here to what was represented by the job loss that we just looked at. So just to give a sense of how quickly things changed, at the end of March, we went from about 5,000 filings per week up to 50,000, up to above 100,000. So a very dramatic and rapid increase in unemployment. I think the good news is that relatively quickly came down in terms of initial unemployment claims. That's what I'm showing you in orange for our regular state program. What's concerning perhaps is the way that's leveled off. So when you look at the most recent months, we're not seeing the situation continue to improve the way we might hope. As recently as December, January, we're still seeing a fairly high number of people claiming their unemployment insurance. In red, and this is the first time we'll take a closer look at the self-employed workers. In red, I'm showing the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. So this made unemployment benefits available to workers who might otherwise be ineligible, such as the self-employed. So this program targeting the self-employed. And you see again a similar pattern, a peak kind of early on in the pandemic during the summer months. A quick improvement or decline in those initial filings, but then a long tail that we still have a fair number of people utilizing this program even in recent months. This is a closer look at the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Programs. This is continued claims. So before we were kind of looking at the flow into the program, here we're looking more at the stock at each point in time. So here again, we see the same pattern of an initial rise in people claiming their unemployment insurance and then a decline. And I think here when we're thinking about the self-employed, we might think about certainly people who were able to reconfigure and maybe get back into their self-employed position. And that's why we see part of the initial decline, perhaps also because the economy opened up a bit during the summer months, the situation overall improved. But then again, that improvement starts to slow down. We still have a fair number of people claiming those benefits in the state. In terms of thinking more about what happened to self-employed people during the pandemic months, I wanted to get a sense of how that was changing in a fairly timely manner. Good data for looking at these very small businesses, looking at what's happening to the self-employed is hard to come by. I'm going to use the current population survey, the monthly survey can help us understand how this changed over time. I'm going to do that by building on an MBER paper that came out earlier this year that looked at self-employment in the same way I'm going to, but for the country as a whole. I'm going to zoom in on the 9th district states and look at how self-employment changed, keeping in mind that we have a smaller sample. We want to be thinking about general trends more so than any given 1 month of data. So first, though, just for comparison to have in our minds, I have what's happening overall in the United States. So what we saw is a 22% decline in self-employment from February to April, and this is active self-employed. So these are people that answered yes to the question, I was employed and at work last week for the reference week of the survey. And then we see that improve through the summer. In fact, as of October, we have almost basically a full recovery in terms of the number of self-employed. So having that in mind as we look forward at what's happening in the region. So here we have self-employed workers for the 9th district states. That top line is the total active self-employed. And what I see when I look at that line is a W pattern. And that's this W shape is something that we've talked about coming up in terms of what might a recovery look like. And I think in terms of self-employment in this region, you see a suggested W. So an initial decline in the early months of the pandemic, much like we saw for the country, perhaps not as severe. We see improvement throughout the summer, clear into August, that we see recovery, people perhaps able to reconfigure their businesses and get back out there. The economy opens up a bit, but then declining in the fall. So as the COVID situation changed, so too do our self-employment numbers. And I think it's important to keep in mind that as the total number of self-employed people is fluctuating, the composition of the self-employed might also be changing. So what I mean by that, I'll talk about in context of the two lines below. So in orange, I'm showing you unincorporated self-employed, and then in blue, the incorporated self-employed folks in the region. So incorporated have a more formal business structure. We might think of these as having a more promising growth potential. In terms of studying entrepreneurship, we might call these opportunity entrepreneurs. And then in the unincorporated sector, a more modest growth potential, we might even think of these as being necessity entrepreneurs, people who are running their businesses kind of as a plan B or because they have to. And the trend line across, the dotted line across these two types of entrepreneurship shows a divergence. So this incorporated self-employment, the more formal higher growth, seems to be on a slight decline throughout the pandemic months. And then the more necessity-oriented, unincorporated, kind of on the decline during pandemic months. So even though the level is fluctuating, I think the type of business we're seeing from the self-employed is also changing. Here we're looking at the active self-employed specifically for Wisconsin, using a dotted line, just keeping in mind that my sample is getting smaller as we look at how this is changing. But we see a downward decline or a downward trend in active self-employment in Wisconsin, and unfortunately, no signs of recovery. And I think there could be a couple of things going on here. The first of which being that we have evidence of a long-term decline in terms of entrepreneurial activity and self-employment in Wisconsin and the country for that matter. So this could be even just accentuating a long-term trend. But I think it's also possible that there are things specific to the state happening here. For example, to the extent that Wisconsin might have a more diverse population of self-employed people, that might also be a factor. I'll show in a couple of slides that for self-employed people of color, it seems the pandemic was particularly severe. So that might be one factor that helps us understand this seemingly persistent decline in active self-employment in Wisconsin during the pandemic months. Here we're looking at the gendered effects for self-employment for the country. And you have a relatively similar trajectory for male and female self-employment. Male self-employment, of course, much more common than female self-employment, but relatively similar dips in the early months of the pandemic, and then a recovery throughout the summer, kind of arriving maybe back near where we were in February of 2020. I think what's maybe not clear, just looking at a line graph, is the relative size of those shifts in the pandemic months. So active female self-employment actually changed by more, declined by more as a percent in the early months of the pandemic. So when we're thinking about April and May, kids perhaps now suddenly at home, we have this workload in terms of the care required, a workload in terms of helping kids at home with schooling. And it does seem to be the case that that coincides with larger declines in female self-employment as well for the country. In the 9th district states, we get a different story. So looking at male self-employment, that top line, we see kind of what we saw before, at least what is suggestive of maybe a W type of pattern where there's a fairly significant initial decline. Things get a bit better in the summer months and then decline again in the fall as the COVID situation evolves. I think what's interesting too is to see the relative stability of female self-employment during these months. Perhaps a bit of a blip there in August, but overall relatively stable, perhaps even some increases in those more recent months. And I think that that could be a number of factors. We might speculate that this has to do with the sectoral composition of where women own their businesses, which industries relative to men, but also perhaps how they run their businesses. If it's the case, for example, that women are more likely to run home-based businesses, this might help us understand some of that stability, whereas males maybe perhaps going out into a work environment and maybe that and facing some restrictions due to COVID, for example. I want to spend time thinking not just about gender, but also about race, ethnicity, and citizenship status. So here we're looking at the trends we observed for the whole country to have in mind. So this is active self-employed, the change from February 2020. So I'm benchmarking each month against where we were in February of 2020, the sort of kind of peak month of normalcy before things changed. And what we see is that we have much larger declines among self-employed people of color and foreign-born relative to the white population there on the far left. So the largest declines among the Black self-employed, upwards of 40% in that first month, and then a fairly robust recovery, actually ending up, above where we were in February. But I think something that's important to keep in mind, even as we see that number come back, is again coming back to how has the composition changed? Are these the same type of self-employed people that we would have seen at the beginning of the year? Similar trend with Latinx, a pretty significant decline to start and then robust recovery, and then more persistence though among the Asian self-employed and foreign-born self-employed. That seems to be a more lasting negative impact of the pandemic. And then for the white population, a relatively small decrease, 17%, and then getting back to normal in the more recent months, relatively normal levels. Now, having that in mind for what happened in the country, again, we want to come back to looking at what was happening in 9th District states, again, benchmarking against that change in where we were in February and then how each month changed during the pandemic months. And again, getting into a smaller sample size, so I'm pooling across states and across these more diverse categories. So on the left, we have the minority, Hispanic, and foreign-born active self-employment. And you just see relatively persistent effects of the pandemic, not the same kind of recovery that we see for the white, non-Hispanic, and native-born. Some fluctuation at the end certainly decreases, it seems, among both categories, but the scale of the decline is just noticeably larger for the minority, Hispanic, and foreign-born self-employed in these states. And if we want to think about why that might be, why we're seeing these disproportionate impacts, certainly a number of factors to think about. Our previous speaker did a great job highlighting some of those issues. I think one thing to think about as well is where or in which industries people of color own their businesses. So I'm looking at minority-owned businesses and what I would call COVID vulnerable sectors. So thinking back to that second slide I showed you, I'm just grabbing the sectors that had the largest percentage decrease in employment and looking at, okay, given these vulnerable sectors, what share of white non-Hispanic businesses are in these vulnerable sectors, American Indian, and looking for each racial and ethnic group. And it appears that we have, about maybe 38% of white non-Hispanic businesses in these vulnerable sectors. But other than American Indian, as we look at racial and ethnic groups, we see much larger shares of their businesses owned in these vulnerable categories. So that could be one of the things that helps us understand these persistent negative effects. So just a couple of closing comments. Certainly, it seems the jobs recovery have slowed. I think when we look at, we got a lot of jobs back and then it's kind of stopping, and then we'll see where we are a few months from now. But already in self-employment, you see the evidence of a W-shaped recovery. When we look at self-employment, it's seemingly near recovered for the US, but certainly varies by region. Not quite there, of course, in Wisconsin, varies by demographic group, importantly. And I think we also want to keep in mind potential compositional shifts. So with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I look forward to questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Tessa. Once again, very interesting content, and looking forward to discussing it after our last panelist. And before I introduce our third panelist this morning, I just want to give a quick reminder to those in the audience, especially those who may have joined late, that we do welcome questions for our panelists. You can submit questions using the chat feature. Those will be viewable to those presenting, and I'll be directing those questions to our panelists after our final presenter this morning. And also we did have a question come in during the last session about whether slides will be available. Again, sorry, a reminder that slides will be available on our website sometime after the conference ends. We will get those uploaded and we'll send a reminder email to audience members when those are available. So with that, I want to introduce our third panelist for our session this morning, and that is Dr. Leonidas Meremzia. Leo is an economic specialist for the state of Michigan's Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives, and an assistant professor of international development for the economics department at Michigan State University. For over 22 years, Dr. Meremzia has provided crucial economic data and analysis to economic and workforce development agencies throughout the state of Michigan, including the state's Upper Peninsula. Dr. Meremzia is also an assistant professor of international development at Michigan State University, where he develops and teaches courses in the economics of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, as well as courses in the evaluation of social research and of public policies and programs. And we're very excited to have him present for us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. I'll be talking about the labor market trends in the Michigan Upper Peninsula during the pandemic. So the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was acquired by the state in 1837. That was the time that the state was admitted to the Union. And that was to settle the Michigan-Ohio War over the Toledo Strip. The UP, as we call it, represents about 29% of Michigan's land. That's about 16,000 square miles, with about 9,000 square miles rich in natural resources, including timber, iron, copper, nickel, and many other minerals yet to be discovered. These are the topics I want to concentrate on during this presentation. I want to look at the impact of the pandemic on the labor force employment and unemployment in the UP. I want to look specifically at the impact of the pandemic on leisure and hospitality services. And then I want to, the previous speakers have talked about their states and the demographics. And so I want to look at the impact of the pandemic by the demographics of the workforce. And of course, at the end, I will give you a recap of the main findings of the presentation. So what is the impact of the pandemic on the labor force employment and unemployment in the UP? The Upper Peninsula of Michigan typically displays unemployment rates that are above the statewide rates. Rates in both the UP and the entire state of Michigan spiked during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. However, as you can see, the dark green line, that's the UP, the increase in the UP was less severe than statewide because the UP is less dependent on the automotive manufacturing industry. Since 2009, as you can see on the chart, jobless rates in both areas have steadily declined. By 2019, statewide and UP rates had recovered to comparable 2000 levels. Entering the recession, entering 2020, let's start from there. Entering 2020, the UP jobless rate was under 6%, while the rate statewide was below 4%. The total number of unemployed was just a little over 7,600 in the UP. As we all know, COVID-19 hit mid-March, and Michigan's response was swift, shutting down many areas of the economy to help slow the spread. However, the UP's labor market was not affected until April. Statewide, the shutdown of the economy in mid-March due to the pandemic resulted in higher numbers of unemployed in March, from 180,000 in February to 198,000 in March. However, in the UP, the decision to shut down public activities came a bit later in April. So in fact, the number of unemployed actually declined in the UP in March to 7,200 from 76 in February, as we just saw in the previous slide. So April, that's where the biggest impact in the data is evident. The number of unemployed in the UP were in tens of thousands. And although it was below the statewide average, the jobless rate almost quadrupled in the UP. The state's unemployment rate soared by sixfold, from 4% to 24%. And the nation's rate more than tripled, from a little over 4% in March to 14% in April. Following the initial pandemic-related shocks, the jobless rate slowly reversed direction and the number of unemployed dropped. By November, the unemployment rate in the UP was comparable to the pre-COVID February rate. So how has the level of employment trended over this period? Employment in the Michigan's UP has steadily declined since 2006. So the decline of employment in the UP is not something new. We've been seeing it since 2006. But employment fell further during the 2008-2009 Great Recession, but at a slower pace than statewide, because again of a lesser dependency of the UP to the automotive manufacturing industry, as we just mentioned in earlier slides. During the pandemic, that's in April 2020, employment in both UP and the statewide dropped by rates never seen before. 17% in the UP and 26% statewide. However, employment quickly picked up in May and June as the economy slowly reopened, and seasonal summer hiring picked up. So by November, for example, employment in the UP was 4.5% above the pre-pandemic March level. So which sectors of the economy lost jobs the most during the pandemic? The industries of arts, amusement, and recreation, and industries in accommodation and food services form the sector of leisure and hospitality, which is a major component of tourism industry cluster in the UP. Payroll employment data in April 2020 are not yet available for the UP. However, looking at the statewide information, we can see that job losses during the initial pandemic shutdown period were concentrated in tourism-related industries of leisure and hospitality. So arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation food services. These are among the lowest paying industries in the state. Leisure and hospitality is the third largest industry sector in the UP. Jobs in this sector were among the hardest hit by the pandemic shutdown in Michigan, as we just saw in the previous slide. In 2019, about 55,800 persons worked in the sector of arts, recreation, and entertainment, arts, amusement, and recreation in Michigan. Around 1,200 or 2% of these workers were in the UP. Most jobs in leisure and hospitality require only a high school diploma or less and pay below average. As a result, most occupations in arts, amusement, and recreation seen here pay less than statewide average, median average of $18.60 per hour in 2019. There were also close to about 392,000 individuals employed in privately owned businesses in accommodation and business services in 2019 in Michigan, of which about 12,200 or 3% were in the Upper Peninsula. A little over 83% of individuals working in accommodation and food services in Michigan were in food preparation and serving occupations. Their pay was about $8 below the statewide median wage of $18.60 in 2019. Please note, and this is something that I need to really say that is particular to the Upper Peninsula. Please note that these numbers exclude employees of tribal-owned businesses in this industry of accommodation and food services, and even the industry of arts and amusement and recreation. Those tribal-owned businesses are counted in local government. So that includes, by the way, the casinos, especially the casinos in the UP are tribal-owned. So those will fall into the local government. While the workforce in the overall private sector is evenly distributed across gender in the Michigan's Upper Peninsula, women hold a commanding majority in the sector of leisure and hospitality, a little over 60% in the UP, 56% statewide. Over 48% of the people working in leisure and hospitality in the UP, 56% statewide, are under the age of 35 years. That is compared to only 30% in overall private sector. This implies that women and youth are most likely to have been negatively affected by the pandemic shutdown in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So what are the impact of the pandemic by workforce characteristics in Michigan? We just saw that most likely the youth and women have been negatively affected. In fact, so here are some facts about the impact of the pandemic on workforce characteristic in Michigan as a whole, because we don't have this data for the Upper Peninsula. Most of this data comes from the current population survey, and for many of you that know this survey, the sample is too small to actually produce the data for the Upper Peninsula. So we're going to look at the state as a whole. Jobless rates and average length of unemployment duration vary by race and ethnicity. Jobless rates for all groups have more than doubled over the year. However, and that's most likely due to the pandemic. However, the average length of unemployment duration has shortened, and that's due to the recalls that started in May, right? So we had a shutdown in April, and by May, some businesses had started, were allowed to start reopening. And so the recall started in May, shortening the duration of unemployment. Individuals who usually work full-time across the same groups that we just talked about, the racial and ethnic groups that we just saw in the previous slide, those individuals who usually work full-time are more likely to be working part-time or not working at all currently. And similarly, we see that Michigan women are feeling the effect of the pandemic as well. So for example, while the share of Blacks and whites who typically work full-time but currently are working part-time or not working at all due to the pandemic, while that share rose by about 5 percentage points over the year, the portion of Hispanics in this same category have more than doubled. The ratio of male workers in this category, when I talk about the category, I'm talking about people who typically work full-time, but are now working part-time or not working at all due to the pandemic. The share of male of that category was up by 4 percentage points. And the share of women soared by 6 percentage points over the year. Typical findings, empirical findings, are that jobless rates tend to be higher for individuals without a high school diploma or those without additional education beyond a GED. Labor force participation rates for these groups also tend to be lower than other groups. what we're seeing today is that jobless rates have more than doubled over the year for individuals in every educational group due to the pandemic shutdown. We're seeing, though, that the labor participation rate has declined for people with a high school diploma, and surprisingly, for those with a bachelor's degree or higher. We still need to find reasons for that. Most likely, the new graduates from universities that are not being able to find jobs right away, and then maybe contributing to this lower participations of bachelor's degrees or higher. So to recap, like the state, the Michigan Upper Peninsula labor market was severely impacted by the pandemic shutdown, which occurred in April 2020. Jobless rates in the Michigan's Upper Peninsula we are typically higher than the statewide average. However, recent economic shocks were softer on the UP than the state overall because the area depends less on manufacturing in general and auto manufacturing in particular. During the pandemic shutdown in April, employment in the UP fell by 17% compared to a 26% drop statewide. Unemployment in the UP quadrupled. The other finding is that tourism-related industries in leisure and hospitality were hardest hit by the shutdown in Michigan in general, and we expect that it's going to be the same in the UP once the data is available. These industries are highly seasonal in the UP and peak in the summer. So as a result, it's no surprise that employment recovered quicker in the UP than statewide as the economy slowly reopened in May and June and in July and August. We found that women and the younger workers are more likely to have been affected by the pandemic layoffs in the UP as they command a disproportionate share of the leisure and hospitality workforce in the area. And lastly, we found that there are more people today who typically hold full-time jobs who are either working part-time or not working at all due to the pandemic. With that, I will thank you, and this is my contact information. If anybody wants to get a hold of me after the presentation, anytime after the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Leo, for your content and for joining us today. We really appreciate that. And with that, we have all three of our panelists now available to have some discussion about the presentations we just heard. I do want to remind our audience that we are still taking questions in the chat. So if you'd like to ask a question about any of the presentations you've just seen, please feel free to submit them. I'm going to start with a question that I have, which is you've all highlighted something that we have been talking about here at the Minneapolis Fed during this pandemic, which is the disparate impacts of this recession across demographic and income categories. In particular, much more severe impacts on lower income workers, those who earn lower wages, and on workers of color. And I'd like to talk about that a little more, but I want to direct one question to Tessa, since you talked specifically about self-employment and the differences in change in self-employment by demographic category. You highlighted how minority-owned businesses are concentrated in sectors that were hit hardest during the pandemic as one reason why we might be seeing the persistent negative effects on self-employment among diverse populations. And I'm wondering if you can speak to other factors that could help explain that trend as well.
Sure, good question. Thank you, Joe. I'll offer two, and I know there are others. The first one would be the relative size of businesses owned by people of color. When we look at that most recent data, it appears that businesses owned by people of color tend to be much smaller, and that's in terms of both employment and sales. So in terms of having the reserves to weather a downturn, those small businesses, those very smallest businesses, which tend to be owned by people of color, just might not have those resources. And these businesses tend to be more likely to be non-employers. So they're just a one-man or one-woman shop. And I think that these factors really speak to your ability to flex and adjust to the situation. So certainly size is a factor. Another factor that I would bring up would be perhaps a less networked position of business owners of color. And what I mean by that, perhaps most concretely, is evidenced by the Paycheck Protection Program. So if it's the case that a business owner of color doesn't have an existing relationship with a bank, that can disadvantage their position in getting access to some of those support resources out there. That's just one example, but I can see where that might play out in other ways as well, being less connected to your local resources. If there was perhaps a rotating loan fund or technical support in terms of accessing the federal programs, if you're less built into those networks, kind of operating on the economic periphery, I think that can also be a factor in terms of weathering the storm.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone, if either of our other panelists want to add any thoughts to that. Actually, Orion, we got a question related to your presentation, which is one of the audience members noted that there was only one of your graphs included Asian Americans among the demographic categories, and was wondering if there was more you could say specifically about how Asians have been affected during the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. We are very limited by the size of the current population survey in terms of the labor force demographics that we can provide, that we can look at. That's the survey, the national survey that generates the unemployment rate and all of these labor force demographic, all of these labor force data points. And in Minnesota, the sample is only 900 households per month. So we're, once you start slicing that by these subpopulations, you're getting to very, very small numbers. And we just simply don't have the data available on a monthly basis to look at. That data, we have to go back to the annual American Community Survey data to look at other populations, for example, American Indians and Asians. And I mean, our office has actually looked into trying to expand the sample so that we can have more demographic data, and it's just not an option the Census Bureau is willing to look at. So, so I just want to put that out there in case there are other people who are interested in this and want to put some pressure on the Census Bureau. We do have the data on other, demographics, more detailed demographic groups through the unemployment insurance program, because these are questions that are asked when you apply for unemployment insurance. So that's why you saw it on that one slide and not other slides. But overall, I think I would hazard a guess that Asians, and I haven't looked at the self-employed data, but I would hazard a guess that Asians, especially in the Twin Cities, are more impacted by self-employment layoffs than possibly than other demographic groups. But overall, Asians have been, somewhat less impacted by this pandemic recession in Minnesota than, for example, Black Minnesotans and women.
Okay. We had another question come in related to this theme, which is that the audience member asked, all the conversations point to the greater vulnerability of women and relatively less educated workers to the pandemic. What are the implications for labor safety and standards at the regional and federal level? What are the implications for family leave and care policies? I don't know if anyone wants to offer thoughts on that. Okay, we'll leave that one. I'm sorry, Ariane.
Well, I had mentioned that supporting the childcare industry through this pandemic was an important goal of our of Governor Walsh's administration and Walz's administration, and that the idea really is that if people are going to be getting back into the labor market, into their jobs, they really need to have childcare to go back to for their children. And so, because in Minnesota we've had such severe labor force shortage issues, it's really impacted that industry. There's been a decline in the number of providers, number of slots. Certain rural areas are basically deserts in terms of childcare. And employers are complaining about this, and so this industry is just really critical to the recovery in this state for sure.
Thank you.
I can add a little bit. I don't know that I can quite answer the question, but I do worry about sort of the long-term impacts of what this might mean for women. Certainly, if we have a large shares of women sort of taking a step back due to that increased workload at home, child rearing, child care, online schooling, that can play out in the labor force for quite some time in terms of it can be hard to re-enter, it can affect wages for quite some time. So in terms of regaining some of that momentum that we've had, I think it might take quite some effort to reincorporate women fully into the labor force.
Good. That actually is a good seg into, Leo, did you have thoughts on that as well?
Well, I would say that just here in Michigan, and I think other speakers have alluded to this, is that just today is that those who are affected are women working in these low-paying industries of leisure and hospitality. And most of those jobs don't require a lot of training. They are mostly short-term on-the-job training. And so I am confident that if the economy rebounds, if we get over this pandemic and we start really the economy goes full, opens fully, this problem may be going away. We don't have data that we can look at by gender and education. Then if more educated women are being affected, then that's another issue. But we don't have that data yet.
So that actually relates to another question that came in from the audience during Orian's presentation. And they wanted to know, and I'll just direct this to all panelists, do you have any data available or any sense to help understand where those who've lost their jobs are going? To what extent are they training into new industries or taking temporary work or just leaving the labor force entirely?
I would say it's too early for us. The only data that I know that can track that kind of movement is the job-to-job data that comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. And that data combines surveys and administrative records, the wage data, and it takes a long time to actually get out there. So it will take at least a year until we know how these people have moved around. And I'm assuming that because so far everybody's mind is that this is a short-term thing that is going to go away once we have the vaccine and everything. I will safely assume that people are going to stay around before they actually start moving around to other sectors or getting into other trainings to go into other sectors. But that's my view.
I would add too, we don't have, or I don't have the kind of detailed data we would need to answer that question thoroughly. But if we were to speculate and kind of base an answer on past trends, I think there's evidence to suggest that some number of the people who are facing unemployment from their wage and salary position might be hopping to self-employment as sort of their plan B or out of necessity. So I wouldn't surprise me if we are eventually able to learn that there is some of that transition happening.
Yeah, this is something to build on those two responses. This is definitely something that we want to be tracking, but again, we won't have the data to look at it for a good year. We're still just looking at for the very detailed data that we would need, we still are just looking at second quarter 2020. But in terms of Minnesota, I mean, 89,000 people have dropped out of the labor force as of November compared to a year ago. So that's a significant chunk of people. We also know that people are saying that they're just uncomfortable coming back into the labor market right now because a lot of the jobs that are available are in the high risk category for infection. So, that's been a concern for employers. Employers are really struggling to fill open positions right now in Minnesota. This isn't new. I mean, we were in a severe labor force shortage a year ago as well, but right now it's a bit more of a head scratcher. The other thing to point out is that, again, only 6.8% of the people who are claiming unemployment insurance currently, or over this period of the recession, have said that they're permanently laid off from their employers. So most of these people still anticipate going back to their previous employers. And we think that a lot of them are probably waiting for that to become an option for them. So that's basically what we know now. And we do hope to continue exploring this question of, for those people that have been permanently laid off who won't be able to go back to their previous employer, where do they end up? And it is a really interesting analysis, but we just won't have the data right away.
So that actually, again, transitions into another question that we got from the audience, which is one of the audience members suggested that the pandemic seems to be accelerating the implementation of automation, and wondering how closely, or if you have any insights tracking, or colleagues tracking the rise of automation, and insights or thoughts on what the macroeconomic impacts are that you'd anticipate from that, and what effects you would see medium to long term on the regional labor economy.
If I can start with that, I don't think we have any tracking mechanism of that here, but that's something that automation has been on the radar of labor economists for a while. That it's going to be displacing workers, and especially workers that work in these low-paying jobs of food servicing and accommodation. Once the fast foods start automating their drive-through and that kind of stuff, so that's something that has been going on for a while. So it could be that this shock is going to accelerate that. We don't know yet until we see the data. I don't know if there's any way we track that here in Michigan. I don't think so. So
I would add that I don't know of any sources where we could look at how that's changed specifically during the pandemic months. I will say we have colleagues that have looked at that in Wisconsin, and I would offer that with the labor market as tight as it was before the pandemic, I know that there's a lot of perhaps anxiety around how automation might change the labor force, and I certainly understand that and don't mean to dismiss it. But again, with the tight labor market, perhaps we might view automation actually as part of the solution for some employers. If the pandemic is indeed temporary and we're sort of headed back perhaps to that scenario, it might actually be part of how we adjust to the changing labor force.
Okay. And actually, since you were just speaking, Tessa, we had a question that was directed to you, which was referencing one of your charts that showed a more robust recovery for employment among Black self-employed workers, and wondering if you have a sense of why that's been the case.
I'm glad that was pointed out. That's certainly something that I noticed as well. And I don't think I have a great answer. I have a sense that we need to keep in mind potential compositional changes in self-employment that I mentioned. So it could be the fact that we're seeing self-employed numbers rise again, but the type of self-employment is changing. So fewer of these incorporated businesses and more of these unincorporated that we might think of more necessity-oriented entrepreneurs. And that could be true across all categories, but perhaps particularly in those categories where the wage and salary market has been, particularly severely impacted. So if workers are working in those sectors, we might see those transitions happening in greater numbers. And then just anecdotally from our working here in Wisconsin, I would say, that we should sort of lift up the resourcefulness as well, that I think that there is a lot of self-employment happening, self-employed people that are figuring it out, recalibrating, reconfiguring, and getting back out there. And I certainly think that that's part of the trend as well.
Okay. So I think this will probably be my last question here, and I'm going to sort of fuse together a number of questions that we got in the chat, which all relate to a similar topic. And that's, I'm going to ask you to get out of your comfort zone a little bit as labor market analysts and offer some speculations or thoughts on policy. So we've had a number of questions about policy responses to the pandemic. One question relating to whether or not the long-term economic conditions might improve if there was a more robust shutdown for a shorter term to reduce the further spread of the pandemic. Another question about given the disparate impacts on the service industry, on women, on lower income workers, whether you have suggestions for policymakers that may be in the audience or the governors of the various states in the region about sort of proactive policy solutions to respond to those things. So I'm just gonna, with a sort of poorly formed question that was made from a bunch of much better formed questions, kind of turn it over to you and wonder if you have any thoughts on policy responses to the pandemic. I was asking you to get outside of your comfort zone. I understand.
I don't know. I mean, as I always say, as a state employee, I'm not really authorized to talk about policies, but I can talk about the policies that are being made already. I mean, the stimulus is a policy that is about to alleviate the impact of this pandemic to the lower income families. Here in Michigan, the governor is looking at a more comprehensive policy of helping, reducing the poverty in general in Michigan. And so we are still working on that. The strategy itself. And so I think those are the things that we need to be looking at in the long run. The governor, when she came into the office, she started talking about putting money into the education to really guarantee that people get an education by a certain period of time. And so all those things are going to be helping the people who are being affected today and in the future to actually getting into the labor force and be productive members of the society.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. It's very clear that the employment is very much impacted by infection rates. So if people are worried about going out, they're not going to go out. And whether there's a shutdown or not, it's going to impact employment. We saw that particularly in November. The period that the survey was conducted was done before our state shutdown of indoor dining and arts, entertainment, and recreation. And it showed a decline. So people were reacting not to whether the business was open or not, but reacting to their own concerns over safety. And that was impacting employment. So I think that I'm not going to say whether I think that there should be further shutdowns or not. That's not for me to determine. But I do think it's clear that the recovery will be calibrated based on how well we do in terms of vaccinating people and just getting back to a place where people aren't worried about being infected. In terms of policies that would support workers who are most at risk, I did talk about the childcare industry. I think there are many policies that would support work for families. So, for example, a universal sick leave policy is absolutely critical for working families, and working families in low-wage jobs often do not have access to paid sick leave. And that, being a mom myself, that would have been a huge problem for me when my son was very young. We're getting a question here in Minnesota at my agency, the Employment and Economic Development Agency, around why are we putting workers into low-wage jobs? Why are we counseling workers in a way that they end up in low-wage jobs? And the answer is because there are a lot of low-wage jobs in our economy, and people need to work. So having a broader safety net would definitely help people weather storms like this, and also potentially help them prepare for higher wage work. So, for example, through education or through training.
I'm thinking along very similar lines to Orianne. I would offer that certainly part of where the economy is right now has to do with the shutdown measures or various restrictions. But I think a big part of that is also about consumer confidence. And even if there were no restrictions, if consumers don't feel comfortable going out, doing their shopping, eating out, that's just not going to happen. So thinking about consumer confidence as we're thinking about policy, I view as being pretty important. And then I would offer, the importance of small businesses, particularly those in sectors or demographic groups that have been disproportionately impacted. I think there's pretty robust evidence to show that in terms of a jobs recovery, that these small and new businesses are really important sources of jobs, a really important pipeline. So thinking about that as we head towards, hopefully a robust recovery.
I am going to take the place quickly of Joe and thank all of our panelists. Joe's had some technical difficulties. We are at our break. And again, I want to thank all three of our panelists for wonderful presentations and great questions from our audience members. So really a rousing start to the conference. And I want to say thanks to everyone. We are going to take a short break. We will reconvene in a couple of minutes. We're going to have a little bit shorter break than normal, but this is a time for you to stretch your legs and come back for our keynote speaker with Governor Doug Burgum. So take a short rest and we'll be back very shortly.
Well, good morning. This is Neil Kashkari again. Welcome back. Thank you to our panelists who had a great opening discussion with my colleague, Joe Mann. It's great now to introduce our one of our guests, Kathy Nesit. Kathy Nesit served on our board of directors at the Minneapolis Fed for 6 years. She's an energy industry expert and executive in North Dakota, a good friend of the Minneapolis Fed, and she reached out to Governor Burgum on our behalf and is going to do the honor of introducing the governor. So Kathy, over to you.
Well, Neil, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this year's Regional Economic Conditions Conference, my fellow North Dakotan and good friend, Governor Doug Burgum. Doug Burgum took office as the 33rd governor of North Dakota on December 15, 2016. Doug brings a business leader's approach to diversifying the economy, creating 21st century jobs, and revitalizing our main streets. And I will just add one little piece here. He also is known for his tagline, innovate, not regulate. Driven by a strong belief in North Dakota's people and a powerful team, he helped lead Great Plains Software from a small startup company in 1983 into an award-winning tech firm that employed thousands of team members from more than 220 cities across North Dakota. Burgum led Great Plains as CEO through its initial public offering in 1997 and acquisition by the Microsoft Corporation in 2001. He remained at Microsoft as a senior vice president through 2007, helping the company stake a position in the global business application software industry. In 2006, Burgum reaffirmed his passion for North Dakota by founding Kilbourne Group, a real estate development firm committed to creating smart, healthy cities through vibrant downtowns. In 2008, Burgum co-founded Arthur Ventures, a venture capital firm that invests in ambitious, mission-driven software companies. In 2009, then Governor John Hoeven awarded Burgum the Theodore Roosevelt Rough Rider Award, North Dakota's highest citizen honor, in recognition of his business leadership and numerous philanthropic efforts, including the Doug Burgum Family Fund. During his time in the private sector, Governor Burgum also served on the Small Business and Labor Advisory Council for our very own Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis from 1990 to 1992. As a council member, he advised the bank's presidents, senior officers, and economists on regional economic conditions. Doug grew up in Arthur, North Dakota. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in university studies from the North Dakota State University in 1978 and earned a master's of business administration from the Stanford University Graduate School of Business in 1980. Burgum is married to Catherine Burgum and has two sons, Joe and Tom, and a daughter, Jessie. We're thrilled to host him today to hear his thoughts on the challenges and opportunities facing North Dakota and the region. Governor Burgum.
Well, thank you, Kathy. That was really over the top on that introduction, but I appreciate it. And thank you for your incredible leadership in the private sector. Thanks for leading the State Board of Higher Education in North Dakota. And thank you for your service to the 9th District. It's an honor to be introduced by you. Great to see you. And also, Neil, thanks for the invitation. Great to be with you and everybody who's online today. And congratulations to you on your reappointment. Everybody in the 9th District, I know, is excited that we have you for at least another 5 years, we hope, because you're doing a fantastic job. And thanks for all you do. And with that, let me also just say to the 9th District, I want to thank, I'm sure there's a lot of team members and staff and leadership from the 9th District, but I've just got a lot of gratitude for the important role that the 9th District is playing in terms of your role, not just here in the 9th District, but in the country. I mean, we've gone through incredible, everybody's focused on the pandemic, but we went through an incredible economic disruption during the past year. And the Fed, with its policies and approach and systems, has allowed us to have the liquidity and the guidance and the leadership and the confidence that's allowed our economy to go through just an incredible up and down in the last 12 months. And people forget that. I think sometimes they're focused on the pandemic, but fantastic. We're so fortunate to have the Federal Reserve. And let me digress right off the bat, but one of the things that we're working on in North Dakota is a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. There's been great progress made on this front. It'll be the 14th presidential library. It'll be situated just outside the entrance to the only national park named after a president. All the other national parks in the system are named after a place. And so this is the only one named after not just a president, but a person, signifying his important role and his time in Western North Dakota really being the cradle of conservation. But why would I bring that up here on the Federal Reserve Board? In the financial crash in 1907, which nearly devastated our country, it was Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster, who was trying to reshape capitalism to be more balanced and not just work for those with capital, but also work for those that were providing the labor in that system, battling against his fellow New York elites back in New York, including J.P. Morgan himself personally. And the two of them negotiated a deal which essentially led to a bailout, which then led to the formation in the 19 teens of the Federal Reserve. And so I'm sure in our presidential library, there's going to be a place to tell the story about how Theodore Roosevelt and the private sector teamed up and then led to the important innovation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And so we look forward to having all of you visit the library, or at least Neil, if we get it done in your term completed, we'll have you there at the ribbon cutting, and maybe you could offer a few words on the importance of the Federal Reserve.
That would be great. Sounds like I'll take you up on that.
Yeah, but on this collapse, I mean, again, I think if you ask the average citizen in North Dakota, what was the GDP collapse in the first 6 months of 2020, people would be focused on the, they might be focused on the virus as opposed to focus on the economy. But North Dakota's GDP plummeted 28% in the first and second quarters of 2020. I mean, this is not, I don't have the exact data from the 1930s, but I think the decline was less steep. It took years to have that kind of decline here in 6 months. And of course, Kathy's deeply involved in the industry that was part of that, which is prior to the first COVID case in North Dakota, we had a complete collapse in the oil markets. Famously, now not only did the price of oil go to zero, we had a day at for the first time on NYMEX futures trading since it was created in 1983. That when people were trying to close out their futures contracts, trading actually went negative for a day. I know there's going to be some lawsuits pending around that trading action, and maybe there'll be some controls that are put in place. But to clear their contracts, people were paying to get rid of their oil, if you will, for an afternoon. So again, we saw a lot of things that the world had never seen before. But the good news is we have rebounded, and again, in part to some federal action, the Federal Reserve, some stimulus dollars, but our GDP grew 22.4% the other way in the second and third quarters. In our biggest economic sectors, we're still in decline, but only 1.4% for agriculture and 1.2% for oil. So we are, so we know that the global pandemic's had a devastating impact on the energy industry. And I just want to say also that this is an important part of our economy in our state, but the state of North Dakota, in particular, the way the tax structure is in North Dakota, where the state of North Dakota receives 10% off the top of oil revenues, how the oil industry fares has more impact on state government than how other industries, including agriculture, fare, because of the state has such a high percentage of our revenue that comes from the oil industry. But when we take a look at some of the Fed stimulus that went into the economy this last year, the checks to individuals, the state of North Dakota has paid out over $900 million in unemployment in unemployment. The PPP program, which was the program the feds put up where there was loans that could become grants for small businesses, in part because the state of North Dakota is the only state that has our own bank, and that bank acts as a bank that backs up the local community banks. We've got a very strong local community banking capability in the state. There was $1.9 billion of PPP loans, the vast majority of which became grants that also were a stimulus in the economy during last year. And so that is that's an important thing to note. In terms of our 2-year budget cycle, however, we are expecting almost $1.5 billion less of oil revenue, or 30% less in oil taxes than was forecasted as recently as May of 19. But our 4 major sales types, sales tax, income tax, and corporate income tax, motor vehicle tax, they're projected to be down 135 million from last biennium, which is certainly manageable given the amount of savings accounts that we had built up, if you will, a rainy day fund of close to 735 million, which represents about 15% of our general fund, as well as other reserve funds. We are excited, of course, that this week we've seen oil prices move back up to in the low 50s $1 a barrel. That's up about a third from 3 months ago, and that's going to help our oil rebound. We were the #2 oil producing state in the nation prior to the collapse in the pandemic. We still are today, but we had a peak that was north of 1.5 million barrels a day. Today, it's recovered back to 1.2 million barrels a day is where we are right now. We still have, in terms of employment in North Dakota, spite of the record payments that we paid out this last year, we still have over 13,000 job openings in North Dakota, and that's significant for sure. And of the 6 states in the 9th district, 5 states, including North Dakota, have unemployment rates of less than 5%, which is ranking in the top third of states. So we are, of course, fortunate in the 9th district. There was policies led by governors in many of those states where our economies had less closures and less mandated shutdowns, and so there was a much more light touch of government in this part of the country, which allowed many of our businesses to keep on operating. And so again, we haven't been as affected as severely as the national economy. And of course, right now, with COVID, which was sort of raging through the 9th district back in October, November, we're very fortunate now that it's on its way down. North Dakota's a 7-day positivity rate at 4.5%. North Dakota and South Dakota are among the states that are leading the nation in terms of vaccine distribution, which is also going to play a key role in helping bringing our economy back. So a lot of positive things happening here, even as the nation this past week had a record number of deaths, record number of infections, and record number of hospitalizations for the pandemic. By comparison, things are looking good for the 9th district. We have been here before, but it was 102 years ago when the flu epidemic raged through our nation, and what we saw, of course, came after that was the Roaring 20s, and so I do have a optimism looking forward that there's going to be some strong economic activity and growth in the decade ahead of us. In terms of some Bureau of Labor statistics, North Dakota had the 3rd lowest number of establishments that experienced any kind of mandated business closure, and we were the 6th lowest that experienced a decrease in demand for products and services. So again, I just pause and say thank you to all the business owners, the business community in our state, because we had entrepreneurs are the risk takers that create these jobs, build these businesses. But during COVID, many of them completely reinvented their business models. And whether that was from dine in to take out, we had local leaders that created flexibility in liquor laws and other approaches that allowed businesses to continue serving their customers, even as people might have been eating at home versus eating out. And so we're very fortunate to have creative entrepreneurs continuing to try to find ways to serve customers. Each of the smaller states received $1.25 billion of coronavirus relief funds that were to be distributed. In North Dakota, we shot for a target of having the majority of that move towards our economy, and we did achieve that. 54% of our funds went to support either businesses directly through grant programs to allow them to navigate the pandemic, or for individuals, including keeping our unemployment reserve fund at the same levels that we entered this pandemic, therefore not raising any unemployment taxes on any of our businesses in the state. And again, in that direct aid going over $900 million directly going to individuals. We spent 30% of that total on public health and safety, and 16% only for continuity of government services. But on that front, a bunch of those continuity of government services, we were able to get out of the bricks and mortar businesses. If DMV's got a state space where it's a waiting room and you take a number to get your driver's license renewed, and we can do that online, and citizens don't even have to come in. We don't have to have the space. I mean, North Dakota's got 24 million square feet of space. We discovered after we took office, after doing the first real estate study, comprehensive really in the state's history. And like a lot of corporations, understanding that we don't need to be paying for all that real estate. And as we move to digital services for citizens, we can offer services 7 by 24 by 365 and do it without the extra overhead of that cost of the public buildings. And so there are going to be some silver linings that come from COVID. Another one of those is telehealth. In a state like North Dakota, where we were short of resources, particularly for things like fighting the epidemic underneath the pandemic, the epidemic of addiction, where we're short of addiction counselors, having the ability to provide telehealth appointments, which, by the way, fewer people cancel a telehealth appointment than they do an in-person one. I'm sure some of that is the shame and stigma of showing up at a social services center, the unfortunate shame and stigma that shouldn't be there for behavioral health and mental health, but people keep their appointments. They get their assistance, and then we can have outreach into rural areas. So there are certainly some things that we've done by executive order that we're looking forward to working with our legislature to turn into law. Telehealth is one of those. As we close out and head towards the light at the end of the tunnel, we've got a three-pronged approach on COVID right now. None of these tools were available to states 6 months ago, and that's why 2021 is going to be different than 2020. First, of course, is the vaccine, which we mentioned. The second is the effectiveness of therapeutics, and everybody on the call has got to get the word out on this. If you know someone who's over 65 and underlying conditions who test positive for COVID, the first thing they need to do, even if they still feel well and their symptoms are mild, is they've got to get in contact with their healthcare providers and consider getting a dose of the monoclonal antibodies. There was a study done in Minnesota where 600 people that were primarily all in long-term care settings, skilled nursing settings, that tested positive received a proactive dose of the monoclonal antibodies. Only 2% of those 600 ended up hospitalized. One of the crises that we're running into, again, across the nation right now is lack of hospital capacity, not just for COVID, but for non-COVID. We've got to keep our ICUs available for stroke and heart attack and trauma, not just COVID. But if we can keep the COVID patients out of the hospital and out of ICU, we can preserve hospital capacity and save lives. And these therapeutics weren't envisioned 9 months ago, and now they can turn a deadly course of COVID into something that's mild. And then the third leg on the stool is rapid testing, with the advent of 15-minute highly accurate surveillance testing at a super low cost. Those tests that right now the federal government's providing free to states, they were priced at $5 a piece. A PCR test in North Dakota cost about $125. So we could test a college student 24 times with a 15-minute test, or we can test them once over the next 6 months with a PCR test. And so again, the surveillance testing, particularly for those that are young and asymptomatic, and mobile and interacting. It's a way for us to break the chain of transmission. So the three legs of the stool: vaccines, therapeutics, and rapid testing. And by getting vaccinated, we can end the damage to the economy, we can prevent more illnesses and death, and we can eliminate and eradicate the pandemic. We can get back to life, the normal life that we're all seeking, where we can gather with family and friends. And that's not a dream future that's far away. That can be relatively soon if we can execute. And so we've been using this fact-based approach. We've been relying on medical experts. We've been putting a strong sense of personal responsibility, putting in common sense protocols, and all of that's helped drive down our COVID numbers. And we want our citizens to have the science-based decisions that they want, the health and safety that they need, and the individual freedom and the local control that they deserve. And we want to return to normal, and we want to have our economy open, and we want to have our schools open. And we've been striving to do that in North Dakota. Virtually all of our schools are in-person learning right now. And we want, of course, protect our friends and family from the pandemic. And so as I close this out, I just want everybody to imagine a day when you can take off your mask for the last time. You can throw it away with confidence. And when you gather indoors at your favorite restaurant with friends and family for a celebratory meal. But that day is coming, but only if we do what we need to be done today to keep ourselves and our families and our communities and our country safe and healthy. And so again, these vaccines that we have right now, again, I encourage anybody that is over 65 and up to make sure that they're getting in line for these. They're effective, groundbreaking. They're extraordinarily effective, 95% efficacy and less than 0.5% likelihood of any kind of severe side effects. And these, I know from the over 50 meetings with the White House coronavirus task force that where we were updated regularly, that all of these vaccines went through a rigorous and transparent approval process with continuous oversight of the experts from FDA. For the state of North Dakota, we've produced a budget proposal for the next 2 years, which reflects the optimism we have about emerging from this pandemic in a strong position, emerging from that pandemic in 2021 and investing in our future. And thanks to the historic low interest rates that's been part of the Fed policy, places like North Dakota, we've got a historic opportunity to invest in our state now and in the future. Our state has been historically very light on bonding. We've got a citizen legislature that, like a lot of our agriculture roots, people like to pay cash for a combine sometimes. But right now, hey, we're proposing a $1.25 billion bonding package for infrastructure, including $700 million permanent revolving loan fund that would support infrastructure projects for generations. And we've got a special tool to enable us to support that bonding. The citizens in North Dakota created a legacy fund that's now topping $7 billion. The earnings that come off of that could be used, a small portion of those earnings could be used to pay down the bonds, so we could put in the $700 million revolving loan fund, take advantage of the record low interest rates, not have to raise taxes $1 to pay off those loans. And we'd have a permanent fund that could provide low interest loans. So, as I said last month in the budget address, it's in trying times like these that there's a natural tendency to hunker down and to focus on the immediate crisis at hand, and probably rightfully so. But we can't lose sight of the fact that our future extends far beyond this current global emergency. And so we're very bullish on 2021. We look forward to seeing what we can accomplish as a state in a region. And I look forward to following up and having a conversation with Neil about all of these topics. So thank you, Neil, for the opportunity to be here.
Governor, that was great. Thank you very much. There's a lot, you covered a lot, and I think there's a lot we could get into. I want to start with COVID. You mentioned North Dakota has been really on the leading edge on the testing front, a lot of testing per capita, as well as on the vaccine front. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Why have you been as effective as you've been? I mean, somebody might say, well, it's a fairly small state. That's true in terms of population, but then you generally have a smaller government as well. And so it isn't obvious to me that being a smaller state is necessarily an advantage relative to a bigger state. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Well, I think it's part of our approach, I mean, we've got, 4 stated values that we use in state government. And the first one is gratitude. And then the second and third are curiosity and humility. And last one is courage. All of those values, we had them packed in our bag when we started this journey 4 years ago. They certainly were helpful facing the pandemic. There were so many unknowns. We had to show up every day with the curiosity to ask literally hundreds of questions about what do we know, what do we don't know. There was sometimes when you're in that kind of stress, people are, wanting to put things in neat little boxes and say, well, this is just like the flu. For example, it's like the flu. It's no worse than the flu. And they'd look at one thing like say the number of people that died and say it's like the flu. It's not like the flu. When people get the flu, you feel absolutely awful. And when you feel absolutely awful and you're coughing and you're sneezing and you feel miserable, generally you then do things like you cover your cough, you stay away from people. Many people with the flu would just not shake people's hands. They would stay at home because they felt horrible. Other family members would stay away from them. And the flu, of course, is unfair in its own way because the flu, even in North Dakota, took lives last year of kids as young as 2 years old. I mean, it can be a killer of all ages. And every year our hospitals fill up with, in the wintertime in this part of the region, with people that are sick with the flu, or flu plus flu turns into pneumonia and it leads to death. So yeah, it's something that we have to take seriously. And that's why we have vaccination programs. And that's why typically, over 60% of North Dakotans get a flu shot. So we know how to deal with viruses, but here we got COVID-19 comes along and you can have it and have no symptoms. You can be a carrier and have no symptoms. That is completely different. So then if you say to yourself, these things are not the same, and one of them you can be asymptomatic and be a carrier, how do you identify those people? Well, you don't find them by only testing sick people that go to their healthcare provider. You have to be proactive and do community surveillance testing to identify it. And one of the reasons why North Dakota was leading the nation in cases per capita, famously, was because we were leading the nation in testing per capita. And we at one point had Grand Forks County was according to the New York Times, the nation's hotspot for COVID. We were testing every University of North Dakota student that came back. Out of 10,000 students, we had 5% positivity rate. And so we had 500 and some cases in Grand Forks County, in a low population county. There was only 11 people over age 65 that had it. There was only 2 hospitalizations, but we were front page news because we were among the first to be doing great surveillance testing. So it is but we plowed through the negative headlines and said, look, if some publications don't understand numerators and denominators, we do, and we have to keep trying to make sure we identify it and break the chain of transmission. And we're continuing to do that now with aggressive surveillance testing. So I would say, to answer your question, Neil, is we just remain curious. We had the humility to say this isn't something we've seen before. We got to try new things, and let's find out the solutions. And then again, listening to the medical experts, whether those from the CDC, but also from the leading companies that we contacted directly, the people providing the testing companies. We had conversations with the CEOs and the chief scientists of the testing companies, as well as those involved in epidemiology in our own state, and saying, what are the tools that are available, and what do we have to do? There's no commercial lab in North Dakota. Even our largest medical providers got their lab in South Dakota. And so the thing that was also unusual in North Dakota is 80% of the tests done in North Dakota were done by our state lab. We had to scale a state lab that was doing less than 200 tests a day up to over 7,000 tests a day. And there were days where we were testing more than 1% of the population in North Dakota throughout this, which is again why we've been at the top among states in testing per capita.
Thank you. That's great. I can tell from your comments that you are a student of history, and I am somewhat of a student of history as well. And I'm just curious, one of my big surprises about this pandemic is if you had told me that 3,000 Americans a day would be dying from a pandemic, I would have told you we're going to be at a warlike posture with everybody locking arms saying, what do we do to save American lives? So I've been surprised that as a nation, our tolerance for death is higher than I would have expected. And you as governor, you can know the right thing to do, but you also have to make the case to the people, and you have to bring the people along with you. And I know you've been very passionate about making the case and earning the support of your North Dakota constituents. I'm just curious, 9 months into this pandemic, what are your reflections? I mean, is there something that jumps out as you that really surprised you or that you hadn't expected in the role that you're in, making the case, looking at the science? It's a really complicated job you've got, trying to lead the people of your state through the pandemic. And I'm just curious if you could share any reflections on that.
Well, I'd say the one thing which is, I would say surprising, but it was a global pandemic and an economic collapse, but it also was occurring against a backdrop of a year that might most likely could have been a very divisive year politically because of the political climate that was existing even pre-COVID. I mean, we were having a fundamental debate between the two major parties in our country pre-COVID about do we move towards a form of regulated capitalism with free markets and innovation, or do we move to something that is more akin to socialism? And we know that when you survey college students and others, I mean, for the first time in a long time, you've got a generation of people that actually think that socialism might be superior to capitalism, and so that was a background that was happening. And so then you get into the pandemic, and I don't want to say politicized, but there was, for every action, whether it was a mitigation action to slow the spread or break the chain of transmission, if it involved putting controls or protocols or restrictions in on the economy, then that became a very vocal debate. And then we're also in a situation where, even versus 4 years ago, the role of social media in creating platforms, alternative platforms beyond the traditional mainstream media, creates a robust environment. So I think every governor in the district and every governor in the nation, and we've spent more time together as governors than any other time through Western Governors Association, which I was chairing during the first part of the pandemic. My term ended at the end of June. The National Governors Association, Republican and Democrat Governors Association, regional governors calls. I mean, we're all talking to each other, but it doesn't matter which party you're in or what state you're in. Whatever action you take, there's a portion of the population that thinks you've done too much too soon, and they can be very vocal. And then there's another portion that thinks you've done too little and too late, and so that sort of environment, I think, of politicizing, whether it was a mask, whether it's the vaccine, are they safe? Are they effective? Are they not? Do masks work? Do they don't? Business restrictions, yes or no? So on that sliding scale, there's a debate. So I think that as we got into it, it became less of a surprise. But when I look back, the extra challenge for all governors, all mayors, all school board leaders, I mean, local leaders, I mean, everybody who is an elected leader was wrestling with this politicization. Sheriffs, I mean, sheriffs in North Dakota are elected. Does a sheriff who's been elected by people that are 80% of that county is a freedom, liberty loving, rural part of one of our district western states, or then they were elected by those people. I mean, do they enforce a law that says that people should wear a mask, or don't they? I mean, so it created an extra challenge that may have been less severe if it wasn't in a national election year. If there wasn't a debate around a national election, it might have been toned down a little bit, but that created extra, let's just say, as we said in the private sector, it created a complex operating environment for decision makers.
Got it. That's really helpful. Thank you. I can only imagine. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about the energy sector. People often ask me, what do I think about innovation in the economy? And I say that, and I'm asking this to you, not just as governor of North Dakota, but also as an entrepreneur yourself, an innovator yourself in the private sector.
Neil, somehow I've lost your volume.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can now. I was working
Okay,
hard
sorry
practicing
about
my
that.
lip. I've been working on my lip reading since we've had all these Zoom and team meetings, but I couldn't. Now I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to shift gears and talk about the energy sector. And both, as you're a governor of North Dakota, obviously, but you're also an entrepreneur, you're also an innovator in the private sector. People have asked me, what do I think is the most important innovations in the economy? And I actually think innovations in the energy sector have been the most important innovations in the economy in the last 20 years, that the fracking industry has effectively put a cap on the price of energy globally. And thinking about the economy, that's profoundly important because energy is such an important input to economic growth. And so I'm just curious, as you think about innovation, as you look ahead in the energy sector, what do you see? Where are you focused?
Well, first of all, Neil, I want to say it's inspiring to hear that from you as president of the 9th District. And I know that you've got a compatriot there with Kathy Nessett, who's been at the center of a bunch of that innovation in the last decade. You are absolutely positively correct. And I would just sort of double down on it. I would say in my lifetime, the biggest geopolitical change in the world, meaning which has an effect on how we spend $900 billion of defense dollars every year in the United States, is that we're in a position for the first time in my lifetime where we can, as a country, sell energy to our friends and allies versus buy it from our enemies. And that single statement, it changes everything about politics. I mean, most people would say during their entire lifetime, the United States has been embroiled in some kind of conflict in the Middle East, and that was all about trying to protect the energy sources and the sea lanes associated with keeping the American economy rolling. So not just energy independence, but we were really moving towards energy dominance. I mean, understand, when I was in high school, there was 2 predictions which were absolute truths that everybody understood, and it was what was taught in college, and that was that the world was going to run out of energy and the world was going to run out of food, through global overpopulation. Those were 2 things that we grew up with. As recently as 2006, every projection for the United States was a continual decline in energy production, and therefore a increasing dependence on foreign buyers. And along comes the technology you're talking about, the combined technologies of the horizontal drilling and then the being able to stimulate those wells in a way to increase production. It's a miracle change to move the U.S. to being one of the largest exporters from one of the largest importers. I mean, completely unpredicted. And so again, we have to remind ourselves about the technology and free markets, as you know, have taken almost 1 billion people on our planet out of poverty in the last 20 years. And so that's remarkable. One of the first times I had an opportunity to be in a drilling shack, and it was before I ran for governor. You're on site. I mean, you've got this image from the 1950s of hard hats and coveralls and people covered in oil with trying to manage a drilling rig. This is a bunch of 25-year-old computer science and professional petroleum engineers sitting in a portable trailer that's filled with computing power. And I'm visiting with the person, and the typical Bakken well is 2 miles down and 2 miles over, so 4 miles away. And I said, and they're trying to work their way through a seam that might in some cases only be 30 feet thick, and they're trying to stay in the middle of a 30-foot thick seam. And I said, well, how accurate are you able to stay within the seam? And the engineer said to me, well, sir, if your house was 2 miles down and underground and 2 miles away, I could drill the lockout on the front door. And so this kind of GPS at the tip of the drilling rig technology that didn't exist barely even 5 years ago, is what's led to the increase. We've had a step function increase in production per well in North Dakota just in the 2018-2019 timeframe. So innovation drives every industry. And as I used to say when I was chairman of one of the software companies that I was chairman of right before the I took office was that, you know, every company, regardless of industry, needs to become a software company or it's going to be disrupted by one. And then you think about, you know, what's happened in the hotel space where you've got, you know, Airbnb, VRBO, and other, you know, home sharing places that last year rented more nights than the largest hotel chains, and they don't own a single property, an asset. You've got the Uber and the Lyfts, which have had during COVID have gone down, but they will come back. The whole sharing economy, where then, you know, even the valuations of some of those companies like Uber and Lyft are greater than some of the car companies. So you have a transportation company that's all software that doesn't own an asset. You take every industry, and that's coming to education. It's coming to other sectors that haven't been hit yet. But you know, if you're not a software company, you're going to be disrupted by one. I would have that be one of the takeaways.
Great. We only have, unfortunately, a couple minutes left. I want to just ask you about the unmanned aerial vehicle technology in North Dakota. I visited Grand Forks and I visited trailers where people were flying drones. It's a key growth area for North Dakota. I'm curious if you could just tell us where that is. And I know it started out about the military and it's expanding beyond the military. Where are you looking for the future?
Well, from a UAS standpoint, very exciting. We made a big commitment in our state. It goes back to Governor Hoeven, now Senator Hoeven, and the private sector teaming up on this over 15 years ago. We have at the University of North Dakota always been a leader in both aerospace and aviation. They historically had, you know, one of the largest or the largest university-owned airplane fleets. They own over 125 planes. They do flight training for students from around the world and for commercial organizations. That led to an early exploration of UAS. And again, we're not just talking about some 6 or 8 rotor Best Buy drone. We're talking about fixed wing, up to 41-foot wingspan type UAS capability. And the innovations that can occur with that, with the advanced technologies for agriculture and energy are enormous. There's one project going on related to ag where, you know, 41-foot wingspan aircraft flying over a 4 by 40 mile area, so 160 square miles of ag land, the Red River Valley, flies over that, can collect a terabyte of data in 1 hour. If you had 640 agronomists on the ground, they couldn't collect that much data in a day. And so the productivity of being able from 7,000 feet in the air to tell before the human eye can detect that the leaf may have some kind of disease or bugs may be in a field is a remarkable leap forward. The same kind of advances are possible that we're demonstrating right now in oil and gas with pipeline safety. And our legislature last year actually even voted, put in $30 million to build out the first statewide beyond visual line of sight capability. So think of it as air traffic control for UAS, so that you've got unmanned aircraft flying safely in the same airspace as commercial flights, private flights, ag aerial applicators at all the different elevations from 400 feet across the ground to thousands of feet. And so, you know, creating safe airspace. So we're working with the FAA, we're working with the aerospace and the private sector industry on this. And because of our commitment to building out that statewide network, in the last 2 years, we've had 15 more UAS aerospace companies either move their operations or move some of their operations to North Dakota. And well, like some states are trying to lead on autonomous vehicles on ground-based and being the centers for that, North Dakota fully has got a lead. We want to exploit it on being the leader of unmanned aerial systems and what those applications can mean for our 2 biggest industries, energy and agriculture. So Neil, thanks for asking about that. It's very exciting. So many great entrepreneurs and so many great innovators entering into that space.
Well, terrific, Governor. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate you joining us. Appreciate your remarks. A lot to follow up on. And we look forward to working with you and staying in close touch. On behalf of all my colleagues at the Minneapolis Fed, just want to thank you for joining us for this conference. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Neil. It's an honor to be with you.
Great. And to all of our folks viewing this, We're going to take about a 5-minute break and we're going to reconvene at 10:50. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you.
So there's trolls on the side of this thing that were distracting me. I mean, there's a,
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for the last leg of the Regional Economic Conditions Conference. Thanks again to Governor Burgum for joining us today to discuss the North Dakota economy. My name is Ron Wirtz. I'm a Regional Outreach Director, similar to Joe Mann, and I'm going to be moderator for the last session. Now we're going to take a little bit closer and deeper dive back into the 9th District state economies from the tacticians that help leaders like Governor Burgum understand their economies and the forces that are driving them. The last leg will shine a spotlight on the western half of the 9th District. So we'll be hearing from North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, which I think is going to help highlight some of both the differences and the similarities that states are experiencing during the pandemic. Before we launch into our presentations, as my colleague Joe Mann outlined to start our program, each speaker again will have 20 minutes to outline current economic conditions in their states. We will have Q&A after all three panelists have presented, so any unused time is going to get kind of tacked on to the back end. Audience members are welcome and encouraged to submit questions at any time via the chat feature in Zoom, and we'll try to get those at the end of the presentations. And again, those interested in panelist presentations after today's event will be able to find them on our conference webpage shortly after the conclusion of this program. And you'll also receive notification via email when they're available. So on to our first presenter, Jeremy Jackson from North Dakota. Following Governor Burgum is a tall order, so we appreciate your help with that, Jeremy, very much. But Jeremy is really ready to add a lot of economic color and nuance, I think, to the governor's narrative about how North Dakota is faring during the pandemic. Jeremy Jackson is professor of economics and director of the Center for the Study of Public Choice and Private Enterprise at North Dakota State University. He produces a quarterly economic outlook report that covers the state of North Dakota, so he is well equipped as a follow-up to Governor Burgum to give us a detailed look at the state's economy. Jeremy, welcome, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, and I do hope that what I have to say is complementary to what Governor Burgum had to say as well, and hopefully adds a little bit more nuance to some things. I do also want to acknowledge that the content that I'm going to be reporting on today is not just produced by me, but I have a center that helps out, and we have many great students that also help with this project. And of course, just like the Fed, you know, the thoughts here really belong to me and not the university. So don't hold them accountable for the things that I say. They're all my fault. My talk is going to be, I think, just a little bit different than many of the other talks that you're getting from the other panelists. I'm going to take a little bit of a broader view of both actually the national economy and focusing in on the state economy. And I want to talk a little bit about the national economy just because our state is not in a vacuum, and what goes on nationally does have an impact. So I do intend to talk both about where we are, so that is taking a look at the lead up to our current situation, but then I also planned to talk a little bit about where we're going to go in the future. And then I'll offer some summary, and of course we'll have questions following all of the panelists' talks. So first of all, where are we currently? And I'm going to look at a number of pieces of data focusing on the national economy initially. And with national GDP, as I pull up data, I want to highlight first of all that I'm using a fantastic resource that the Federal Reserve Bank provides in what's known as FRED. And it is a great data resource for those who are interested in things like data. These graphics come largely from that website. And I've pulled up data on national GDP from 2005 to the most recently available data. Most of the data that I show you will be on a quarterly basis. And you can see the recession that we had in 2008, 2009, followed by pretty steady economic growth. And then, of course, as the pandemic hit in 2020, we saw historic decline in GDP in second quarter, but then, of course, followed by a historic rise in GDP in the third quarter. And I'm highly anticipating what might happen in the fourth quarter of 2020 as that data becomes more apparent. And we also had some interesting things happen in the world of the unemployment rate. We see that in the previous recession in 2008, unemployment went up, but then with the pandemic, the unemployment rate nationally again spiked to unprecedented levels, and it's come down, but it's still certainly at a much higher level than what we had pre-pandemic. And there's some other variables that I'm going to introduce as well, because they just give us a good gauge on what's happening in the economy overall. Consumption patterns followed a similar pattern. In the previous recession, we had a decline and then a return to growth of personal consumption. Of course, in our current recession, again, historic decline with actually a historic period of growth directly following. And investment in the economy has also followed a very similar pattern. Corporate profits, interestingly, have had a little bit of a different pattern in that we had, yes, some big declines. We've had big declines in the past, but actually corporate profits, as they picked up in the most recent data, are actually back to above what they were pre-pandemic. So that's kind of an interesting piece of data. And of course, in North Dakota, the activity that's happening in energy markets is incredibly important to what's happening on the ground. So here is a chart of West Texas intermediate crude future prices. And we'll see that, historically, if we look at an average, and this is, again, going back to 2005, we'd be at a level right around here of maybe historically averaged around 70. And this is $1 per barrel. The pandemic, as most of you probably recall, had this historic just collapse in the West Texas intermediate price. We actually saw the futures go to negative for a period of time. Of course, that didn't last long, but as we've come back, we're getting into an equilibrium here where the price is significantly lower than that historic trend. And that's actually what's driving a lot of the problems that North Dakota's economy is currently facing. And so with that, I'll switch over and talk about some of the data that's specific to the state of North Dakota. And this is a graph that shows the total wages and salaries for the state of North Dakota. One of the interesting things, and I'll show this in some other graphs as well, is that in the previous recession, wages and salaries in North Dakota were actually growing. North Dakota historically has actually, it's an interesting thing, but we've historically done well when the rest of the country is in a recession. That's not true for the current recession. So in the current recession, total wages and salaries did fall drastically in lockstep with the national economy. And I know that this conference is highly focused on the labor market and labor force issues. The labor force has been one of the key things that has been even maybe preventing the state of North Dakota from growing as much as it could. We have jobs that are open and unfilled. So this labor force issue has been a big one. And there's a lot of work that we need to do on how to attract a labor force. But again, the labor force itself is having a big impact from the pandemic. And lots of people actually are leaving the labor force. So not only do we have fewer people perhaps moving here for jobs, but people who have been here are electing to leave the labor force as well. And of course, one of the interesting things is that while the labor force is declining, we also have these increases in the unemployment rate. North Dakota's unemployment rate has historically been quite below the national average, especially in the recent years. But just like the rest of the economy and the rest of the states, we did experience a large spike in unemployment that came along with the pandemic. The unemployment rate has come back down significantly in our state, but it's still above the level that it was. But again, this is one of those interesting things that our labor market has been so tight that having a little bit more, normally a little more unemployment might not be a bad thing in terms of having some churn and turnover for the availability of workers to firms that are trying to hire. The problem is we're also simultaneously seeing that decline in the overall labor force. And just to give you an idea of how unemployment trends with the national economy, here is a graph that has both on the same chart. And you'll see that the national unemployment rate spiked at a much higher level than it did for North Dakota. So we had an increase in unemployment, but not as much as what was experienced by the rest of the economy. So next, I'll just talk a little bit about our gross state product. And as an economist, this is one of the key pieces of data that I tend to focus on. And again, I'll point out that in the previous recession from 2008 and 2009, North Dakota actually was growing as a state. And then after we had this period of growth throughout the recession, we actually really boomed from 2010 to 2012, and then again maybe through 14. And a lot of that was driven, of course, by drilling that Governor Burgum talked about in his time. But of course, we've been fairly flat and stagnant lately, and again, that's partly due to those issues with the price of oil holding drilling down, but also those labor force issues that's preventing some of our companies from maybe hiring more employees than they would want. And again, we see that the state of North Dakota had this decline with the pandemic. Our gross state product fell, and it fell by a historic amount. We then also had a big increase in the third quarter of 2020. But again, that increase wasn't enough to compensate for the loss that we experienced in the previous quarter. And I want to try to tie this trend for North Dakota to what's happening in the national economy. And it can be difficult to graph gross state product along with a measure of gross domestic product for the nation. So what I've done is I've graphed the percentage change for each, okay? So, and the reason is that the scales are just very different. Obviously, gross state product is much smaller, especially for a small state like North Dakota, than gross domestic product for the country as a whole. So this graph shows us the percentage change quarter by quarter in gross state product for North Dakota, which is the blue line, and real gross domestic product for the nation, which is our red line. And notice in the recession of 2008, 2009, national growth rates were below zero. We were in a national contraction. Yet at the same time, and granted, there's a few quarters where there was some very small negative numbers for the state, but mostly the state of North Dakota was growing over that period of time. And then of course we had that historic growth period that I mentioned previously. But one of the things I wanted to point out with this picture is that for the most part, the state and the national economies aren't really moving together that often. And if anything, our state economy shows a lot more volatility. That is, a lot of big changes in gross state product versus the percentage changes that occur nationally. And then we head to the current pandemic situation. And then the historic decline in GDP that happened for the country as a whole. And then that's followed by that big spike, the growth rate that we hit in third quarter of 2020. And I'll just point out something, because this is something that often gets a little confusing for people, is that in this chart, I'm graphing the quarter by quarter growth rate or percentage change. Governor Burgum talked about the changes in GDP, and if you'll notice the axes and the levels that are here, we're looking at a state decline in gross state product of about 7.5% in second quarter of 2020, which is a different number than what Governor Burgum mentioned. And I want to point that out just because I'm using the quarter by quarter, but most of the media often report an annualized measure. And the annualized measure, especially when we have these historic changes, can tend to make the percentage changes sound a little bit bigger than they might actually be. But the percentage change was actually more in the magnitude of 8% and then the following economic growth after that. And one of the main things that I'm interested in as an economist is actually the effect of this on tax collections. And one of the things that is a limitation for myself versus Governor Burgum is that Governor Burgum uses different data than I do. He has data that he gets, of course, directly from those who collect taxes. I get the tax dollar information that I use from the nationally reported official statistics. And we don't yet have data at the state level for tax collections in the state of North Dakota for the year 2020. So I don't have any of the actual pandemic tax collection data for the state of North Dakota. So that gives us an idea of where we are. I tend to think the more interesting part of the talks that I give are focusing on where we're going to go from now. And with that, I always have to caveat many of the things that I'm going to say. And many of the speakers that we heard earlier mentioned that they didn't want to make predictions, but clearly I intend to give you at least something in the form of a prediction about where we might be going. And I do publish a quarterly economic outlook report for the state of North Dakota. The link is here in the slides. And the model that I use, and this is again why I'm so thankful for the resources of the Federal Reserve Bank in the FRED database. All of the data that I use actually comes from FRED. And I use a methodology in the forecast model that I report, known as vector autoregression. You can look that up on your own. I'm not going to go professor on you and talk about the methods. But I do, as I give some of this information, I have to caveat the things that I say. The one thing that we all know is that every forecast is always wrong. And that's true of any forecast that I can show you. But I still think that forecasts are valuable. And the reason is they can give us information and uncover trends in data that we wouldn't be able to see otherwise. So even though it's clearly the point estimates of what I'm going to show you aren't going to necessarily be absolutely correct. Sorry for that. I do think that there's value in looking at them. They allow us to see trends in data that you can't just see by eyeballing the data, that you can only really see by letting the deep relationships that are behind the data actually showing us what's going on. And I show you these forecasts because I believe they're useful in that sense of providing us with information. And I did run this last piece of forecasts on January 9th. And so I will go quickly through this, but I do want to point out that we have some extremely volatile times. So really most of what I'm going to end up saying with respect to thinking about the future is that we just have tons of uncertainty. We just had historic downturn in Q2 of 2020, followed by a historic period of economic growth in Q3. What that means is we are currently in a situation with what is just really a very volatile system. And data-driven approaches to forecasting aren't really that good at making some predictions. So here's a forecast of what could happen in the national GDP. And here I'm showing you a trend line that is a forecast that's pre-pandemic. And then we have the post-pandemic actual data. The portion of this that is red that I'm outlining now is the portion that's forecast. This shaded region presents what we call a confidence interval, which gives us an empirical way to view really the uncertainty in the estimate. And what we see, and again, this is where part of the problem is, we're at a historic moment where we just had unprecedented economic growth in the last quarter, which means the model itself is actually predicting continued levels of economic growth and extremely large levels of economic growth. But notice that the confidence interval there is really big. I really have very little confidence at all in what I would call this trend line. If anything, what I think this shows us is that I think that our economy is likely poised. We're in a position that we could experience economic growth, but really only if we go to what we would call the normal. If we could eliminate the pandemic right now and go back to normal, I do think that the economy would be in a situation where we would return to a growth trend. And I'm going to skip through some of these other slides and go ahead and talk about the state economy as I respect the time of our session. But again, the same things that I said about the national economy tend to be true here in terms of the state economy, and that is that that we have just drastic amounts of uncertainty. And again, I'll flip through and show you what the unemployment rate forecast looks like, and you'll notice it's just got a huge confidence interval. With that, I'll go ahead and conclude. There's more slides that you can look at if you go back to the website later, and I'll turn this back over to Ron. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate it. I can appreciate the time limits. It's awfully hard when you have lots to talk about to try to squeeze in 20 minutes. Again, the utility is we'll be able to provide that slide deck so people can get an awfully more rich and deep look at all of your data. So our next speaker is Mark Kwasny from South Dakota. Mark is the state economist for the South Dakota Bureau of Finance and Management. In this role, Mark is responsible for forecasting general fund revenues, as well as advising and informing state leadership on the state's economy. Please welcome Mark Kwasny.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate it. And I appreciate Jeremy's presentation. As a fellow forecaster, I know putting a forecast out at a time like this is it's a brave thing to do. So I applaud him for doing that. So today I just wanted to walk you guys through a snapshot of some of the metrics that we've been looking at during the pandemic here in South Dakota, some new data that we started looking at, and walk through some of the questions and answers that data has led us to, and then provide a high-level view of the pandemic's impact on workers in the state in terms of employment and compensation. So this first set of charts here come from a weekly metric that we've put out for a number of years here in South Dakota, and it shows 5 years of actuals and then a 25-year average, which is the black dotted line that you see here on your screen, of initial and continued claims here on the right. So initial claims on the left, continued claims on the right. And so we can see that we had the historic spike in initial claims that began in mid-March and then peaked the first week of April at just over 8,000 initial claims. And then, we started to come down from there. We did have some disruptions related to the rollout of that pandemic unemployment assistance program and some of the legacy issues that we have with an older claim system. But so that caused some of this funkiness that we're seeing here in the middle, but overall, they rapidly fell, just almost as rapidly as they rose, and then stabilized on a slow downward trend over the course of the year. And so now we can see, for the past couple of months, we've been hovering, at or around that 25-year average for initial claims in unemployment. And so this last week of 2020 here was 655 claims initially for the week. And the 25-year average was 631, so slightly above average, but relatively close, especially in consideration of the spike that we saw here. And so we know that the unemployment caused by the pandemic was temporary in nature, or we had hoped that was going to be the case, that a lot of this was temporary, especially when we think back to March and April about the 2 weeks that we were asked to stay at home and some of those things. And so we knew that looking at continued claims would be really important to understand how the economy was functioning and what was going on there. So on the right-hand side, we've got the chart here. It peaked slightly after the initial claims peak, and then it started to fall at a slower rate. We were concerned, were we going to see a long plateau? Was it going to be a very slow decline? I think the decline that we saw was fairly rapid, especially in consideration of the rest of the country. But overall, a slow decline. And so we do get an interesting look here about the impact of those the $600 PUA stipend payments per week. And so we can see that for the week ending August 1st, which is right here, we were at 14,715 claims paid that week. And then the next week, August 8th, it dropped down to 8,949. So just about 6,000 claims. And in most states, that's not a large amount, but in South Dakota, that's a pretty large number. Again, as the year progressed, we slowly trended down towards this 25-year claim. We ended the year, 25-year average. We ended the year at 3684, and then the 25-year average there is 3496. So still slightly above, but I think especially relative to where we were at the peak, a pretty good place to be at here in South Dakota. So the impact to employment was so large and it happened so quickly that it really left us scrambling for more information. I think policymakers were wanting to understand what was going on. And, we had conversations, I had conversations with Ron about data and what was available. I think similar to many other states, just like I had mentioned, our reemployment system is older, and the ability to pull much in the way of custom reports doesn't exist. But also the staff at the Department of Labor here in South Dakota was overwhelmed with those claims. They flexed all of their additional resources. They stopped people from doing their normal jobs, flexed them to processing claims. And then the technical staff were just focused on keeping that system operating under the strain that it was under. So asking them to figure out a way to pull custom data didn't really make sense, as it wasn't going to be serving the citizens of South Dakota well. So we started to look elsewhere for more frequent data, and what we arrived at for employment was job openings data. And I know it's not always the cleanest data or the best data, but in a pinch, it was helpful for us and helped us understand what was going on. And we were able to use it slightly differently because of it's a newer system, and it was relatively easy for the department to just do a weekly data pull and provide us at least some geographical context to the numbers that we're seeing here. So we started right at the onset of the pandemic here in South Dakota. That's our first week ending March 14th. So the governor started to issue her executive orders and ask for some school closures on around the 13th of March. And so this is the cleanest data we have before any pandemic impacts in South Dakota. And so we can see we were 19,000, just over 19,000 job openings statewide, which is on the blue line here. On the gray line, then we have the Sioux Falls MSA, which started the year 7,000, just over 7,000. And then on the orange line, we have the Rapid City MSA. And so for those of you unfamiliar with the geography here in the state, those two MSAs are our primary population centers. The Rapid City's on the far western part of the state and has compromises about 16% of the state's population. And then Sioux Falls is on the far eastern edge of the state, and it makes up about 30% of the state's population. And so combined, these account for about half of these job openings. We can see that we reached a trough in the number of job openings in all three areas, statewide and in the two MSAs, about that week of May 2nd. Statewide openings were down 25% from their peak. We were really concerned that we weren't going to see any impact, that, maybe employers just weren't going to close out jobs, but we did see an impact. 25% I think is pretty significant impact in that area. Similarly, in Sioux Falls, which was more impacted early on by the virus, we had more spread and more community spread in the eastern part of the state in the early months. That was down 28%. And then Rapid City was down 22% at that statewide trough. And then we've been generally recovering since that point. In the Rapid City area, we were pretty concerned watching this, especially going into the May and June timeframe. That area is really reliant on tourism, the tourism industry, and we know that was that impact of that was very outsized, especially early on. And so when it came through and the state started to recover and Rapid City started to recover as well, we were really surprised by that. And so trying to understand that, we have Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, we have different contacts in the state, and we have the State Department of Tourism, and they really have a lot of contacts in the industry and help us understand what was going on. And so, really what the state was able to do, what we did at the state level, and then what the communities did, what the business owners did, is after that initial lockdown period, they pivoted their business strategy and their advertising to be, hey, come to South Dakota, and we've got wide open spaces here that'll be safe for you to, enjoy some time with your family, with those close to you in a safe setting. And so we still saw some impacts, some negative impacts to like the hotel industry. But on the flip side of that, campgrounds had record years, both private campgrounds, state campgrounds had record years. The number of permits sold by the National Forest in the Black Hills was at records. And so people did come, they did enjoy the outdoors in South Dakota, and that really saved the Rapid City area, which was an interesting thing that we learned here, that as those business owners were looking at what was happening to their bookings, as the state pivoted the strategy, they still hired individuals and they kept those job openings open because they were still having the bookings coming in. So, and that really turned the conversation from, are these companies going to be able to survive a year with little to no revenue, back to one that similar to what we typically had with that industry, and that's they had trouble finding labor force. They had trouble finding workers. There was concerns about a potential work disincentive created by the $600 additional payments. There was concerns about, there was workers that just because of the pandemic, they wouldn't be able to return to work as normal. And then one area that in recent years is really, they've leaned on heavily has been bringing in temporary workers from overseas. If any of you have driven through the state, stopped at Wall Drug in the summertime, they have a lot of workers from Asia, Mongolia, China, Japan, those areas that they employ. With the pandemic, they just weren't able to do that. And so it was an interesting conversation to have with them and to watch that play out. Overall, we can see that jobs recovered well, over the course of the rest of the year, and that right now we're above where we were at before the pandemic, which is interesting when we look at the chart here on the right. We don't have historical data for weekly information because we just started those data pools when the pandemic started, but we do have monthly information. And so we started to add this context once we had some more months of the pandemic to view. And so we've got 3 years of history here that the most recent data that we have is through November. And so we can see 2018, 2019, we kind of follow this curve where we have lower job openings in the fall and winter months at the beginning and end of the calendar year. And then we peak right around August, which is when the Sturgis Rally occurs in South Dakota, which represents kind of the peak of our tourism season here in the state. We inverted that this year, obviously, so you can't really see that on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side gives us a view of that. We're excited to see that job openings are above where they were last year and where we were before the pandemic. That would seem to be an indicator that businesses that are hiring have a positive outlook going forward. And so that gives us some good feelings about what's happening in the state in terms of employment and the overall economy. So this brought up some questions, on the flip side of this. So employment's happening. We're seeing some recovery there. We saw losses, we saw recovery, but what's happening with wages? You start to hear anecdotal evidence about we're losing higher paying jobs and gaining lower paying jobs. The income data that we typically look at, with the stimulus, PPP, extra unemployment, and then just the general conditions in the labor market, and the fact that it comes out mostly on a quarterly basis, we were just looking to add some further context and help us get some more information and understand what's happening, more than quarterly. And so we again looked at this jobs opening data. And this chart represents 3 years of history for average wage of posted jobs. And so we weren't capturing this weekly. We haven't been capturing this weekly, but we do look at it monthly now. And so it seems to kind of support when we first started looking at it, seems to support this notion that we're seeing some stagnation in wages, that wages are maybe even coming down. Maybe there's some churn in the types of jobs that are being advertised. And so, our hypotheses, maybe we've got a higher pool of potential labor with the unemployment situation being what it is, or maybe there's higher uncertainty that firms are experiencing. And so, yes, they're willing to hire, but maybe at a lower wage, or maybe it's all of those things combined. But we wanted to try and better understand it and see what was happening. And so we dug in a little bit more on this data, and we're starting to learn how to use it a little bit. We look at this chart here shows the top 5 categories in terms of the numbers of opening. And so it's a snapshot. What we have here, it's a snapshot from the year prior to the most recently available data. So on the right hand, we've got November, and then on the left hand, we've got November of 2020. On the right hand, left hand's November of 2019. And then in the middle, we have February of 2020, which is kind of in the middle, but also it represents just before the start of the pandemic. And so last year when I was here, I talked about the importance of healthcare, the healthcare sector in terms of future employment growth in the state of South Dakota. And this chart really demonstrates that point really well. You can see we far outpace the blue line here, the lighter blue line being healthcare job openings, as demonstrated down here. Far outpaces the rest of the categories in the top 5. And so we started to kind of look at what was happening as far as wages. And I think it's important to note that, this is roughly 20% of the job openings, at any given time are related to healthcare, which is a really significant number. And it's going to be significant to the wage information that we're looking at. So we look at the same chart, the exact same chart, but using wage data, average posted wage, as opposed to the number of postings. And so we can see in orange here, we've got management occupations has moved up, less jobs posted, but a higher wage. But then healthcare is strong. It's a really strong number. And so when it's 20% of the base and it's a strong number, we know it's going to be have an outsized impact. We can see most of these are generally stable. We had some retraction in management wages, but that's recovered since then, and we're above where we were a year ago. But we can see that we've got this kind of curve that formed on the light blue bars with healthcare wages. And so we know that whatever's going on with our wage data is happening in the healthcare sector, which is pretty poignant with the pandemic going on. To dive into that a little bit more, we just pulled that and we look at it monthly, and then we look back to July of last year. And so we had, relatively stable wage postings going on, and then starting really late last year, December, January, and then early into 2020, late 2019, and then early 2020. It's 2 weeks in, I still get a little bit of grace, I guess. But we started to see growth in that average wage of posted jobs. And so that right there for now is where my answers kind of stop and my questions begin, that, we still have to sort some of this out. And we can see that we've had a really precipitous drop occur here in November data. And so what's going on here, what's going on here in the middle of all of that is where our questions are. Is this related to the pandemic? Is this, healthcare providers are trying to attract healthcare workforce to deal with the pandemic? Do we have some sort of data anomaly going on where, the average, the posted jobs were just higher for some reason? Is it the types of jobs that are being posted? I think there's some good questions to be answered there. Luckily, then we can kind of, once we have an idea of what we're seeing, we can then look back at those more normalized, those more normal sources of data that we look at. And this is, the BEA information that comes out quarterly on compensation of employees by industry. And this chart here shows in the blue just the total private non-farm compensation by quarter on an annualized basis in the state. And then the gray is healthcare and social assistance. I didn't do anything to make these two lines match up. They just did that on their own. And so I think it's a pretty good indicator that we have actual, that those two move in concert with each other. We don't have any great divergence from the statewide number here among healthcare. And so I think what we're seeing is, especially when we look at the third quarter here, we're seeing strong growth. And I think it's important that there's not any divergence going on. And we had that retraction in Q2, but we're seeing growth above. And so the jump in Q3 might even suggest that we're seeing wage increases, especially when we consider that we've got a decline in total employment. And so this chart here shows compensation by industry. And so these are the 4 industries that we have some reductions that we're still seeing. All the other industries, the compensation has rebounded, so we've got growth. So I just wanted to highlight those that are negative. At the top here, we've got state and local government, and that's down slightly, 1.3%. And then the next is the blue line, accommodation and food services. That's the most impacted when we think about the pandemic. That's down 13.2%. Management of companies in the orange line, which is down slightly at 2.9%, could be related to, bonus activity that we would expect to occur there or things of that nature. And then the yellow is the arts, entertainment, and recreation, which is fairly hard hit, down at 10.2. But the blue and the yellow are the most hard hit. That's what we're seeing nationally as well. Next, here's a chart that we put out for a while, showing 20 history on a year-over-year change in non-farm employment growth. The line is the state of South Dakota. The red line is the United States. We can see that typically during a recession, South Dakota performs better than the rest of the country, and then during a non-recession period, South Dakota does not perform as well in terms of employment growth. So we're a little more stable here. We can see that we ended, this is November data, the US was down 6% and South Dakota was down 3.1%. And finally, the last chart here, I just wanted to go over the sectors, the major sectors of employment and where we're at on a 12-month rolling percent change. And so we can see the most hard hit is going to be leisure and hospitality, down at 14.7. We do have some growth in construction related to the housing activity that we're seeing nationally, which is occurring in South Dakota as well. And then other services down 7%. So overall down 3.1. And so with that, that's my overview of the state, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mark. A great presentation. Really is a nice compliment to North Dakota. So we're really learning a lot so far in this third leg. And last but not least, always a difficult position to be in, but I know our speaker's up to it. Our next speaker is Pat Barkey from Montana. Pat has very deep experience in the kinds of topics that we're talking about. He has served as director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana since 2008. But he's been involved in economic forecasting and policy research for more than 30 years in both the private and public sectors. His latest research has been on energy and natural resources, as well as value-added agriculture. Pat, bring us home.
Thank you, Ron. And I want to say first my appreciation to the Federal Reserve for connecting us and serving as a convener. I think that's a super valuable role. Here in the western part of the district, it's a little more difficult. 7 hours I'm driving west, I'm in Seattle. 9 hours I'm driving east, I'm still in Montana. So it's difficult. So here's an outlook-oriented presentation. We're looking at where we are with respect to the COVID recession at age 10 months. As other speakers have noted, unprecedented is the word we're overusing. Unprecedented downturn, unprecedented recovery. The low point was clearly March, April. We had some very swift policy actions, which I think had an enormously beneficial effect. I think we've been a number of surprises, to put it mildly, through this entire experience. But I would say that most surprises since midsummer in terms of the economy have been positive ones. I think it's been a period of time when our aggregate economic measures have largely been overmatched by the speed of this cycle, this down-up cycle. And many other speakers have noted the other kinds of things that they're looking at. I think parts of the economy have more than recovered. Parts of the economy, this has actually been a boom. Others face daunting challenges. I think one of the messages is a very tentative one, but nonetheless, it's looking like Montana is looking like a state less affected than others. That's not saying we're doing well. We're all flunking this course, but some of us have at least performed a little bit better. When you talk about the outlook, everything depends on the pandemic. And my favorite graph of this is this one from Johns Hopkins. New cases per 100,000. This is as of yesterday. A week ago, these were all red, which meant we were all going up. Now it's more mixed, but nonetheless, we know we're in a bad state with respect to the pandemic, and this has, highlights the uncertainty of all the kinds of things that all of us are saying on this program. But one of the things that really has emerged since the low point of this pandemic, as I think, a little bit more optimism about the overall economy. When you look at the forecast of GDP that was made by this national forecasting firm, IHS Markit, way back in, it seems like a long time ago, in December 2019, it was continued growth. And then, of course, what happened is at the midpoint, that was changed radically. And you can see how much longer it's taking for the economy to pick back up to its pre-growth, pre-pandemic trajectory. And I think the big story here is that there's been a pickup, even in the most recent forecast just came out a couple of days ago. This is ugly. Okay, this is a recession. It's bad. There's no good way to put it. But relative, especially to the Great Recession, it's much quicker, both on the down and the up, and that's important. So here in Montana, we're trying to solve some mysteries, and here's a mystery, and maybe you in this audience can help me solve this today. We've seen an epic labor market event. So we've seen a huge increase in unemployment claims. These are continued claims that continues to persist to some extent right to this day here in Montana. But then you put this side by side with other measures of economic activity that do not show any kind of seismic epic event of that nature. In fact, they show continued growth. If you look at the withholding on Montana's personal income tax, and you look at it on a fiscal year basis, so that each of these represents a 6-month collection, there's been no decline. There has been, in fact, continued growth in this measure of economic activity, which is not perfect, but it is up to date. This is right through December on a calendar year basis, which is the first 6 months of the fiscal year. In fact, when you look at this rather busy table of all of the state's tax collections, it's rather striking. The bottom line measure at the very bottom, the state's general fund collections 6 months into this fiscal year are ahead of where they were 6 months ago. And in fact, when you look at this withholding measure, I'm pointing that out there a little more specifically, you can see where we stand continued growth. On the other hand, there are clearly other smaller, but nonetheless very indicative kind of measures that tell you a little bit about the hardship. Here's one, the natural resource collections, which are impacted both by price and production, as well as some of the tourist-related measures. But so there's the mystery. It's a horrible labor market event, but it's not showing up, at least in terms of the money people are making. And it's causing us to say here in Montana that this recession has been more of a jobs recession than a wage recession. We like to look at this data from the UI system, the QCEW, Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. We have it through the second quarter. And you can see the seismic reduction in jobs. These are indexed, by the way. The big reduction in employment is not echoed in big reductions in wages paid to all workers. So what does that mean? Of course, that's got to do with the mix of those job losses, but also what's going on in terms of hours worked and wages in the sectors that are doing better. So here's another way of looking at that. When you look at the job losses by sector, normally I do this on a year-over-year basis, but this has been such a fast-moving event that this is just a 2-quarter change. And in order to do this, I had to seasonally adjust the data. But with those technical details aside, you look at these declines just in the first 2 quarters of 2020 in Montana in these industry groupings, and it's all very ugly, but one, of course, stands out. This is not percent, this is number of jobs. The number of jobs in accommodations and food that have been shed in the state economy is truly epic. Healthcare, retail, you can see all these other sectors. Other includes a lot of things, including manufacturing, professional services, and some things that are not detailed on this graph. But a very ugly job experience when I put up the same graph from the same source, but instead I look at wages, a slightly different picture emerges, not totally different, but now you start to see some sectors actually showing gains in the teeth of this recession in terms of wages paid. It was very quietly a couple of quarters for the banking industry. PPP deposits are high. A big year for some other individual industries, mixed in with some truly awful experiences for some of the industries you see mentioned, including obviously healthcare and accommodations and food. So one of the things that we look at, and this is a very tentative picture, is if you take the same scorecard, the quarterly census of employment and wages, and you take a look at how all 50 states have fared, again, on this 2-quarter seasonally adjusted kind of thing, where I hesitate to draw inference from just 2 quarters worth of performance, but nonetheless, it is striking the heterogeneity in how states have performed. The worst case being Hawaii, the best case being Utah, and the best is still pretty awful. I definitely note that. Montana being a little bit more towards the higher side of this all flunking class, if you will, joined by many other states in the same part of the nation, joined by Utah, is clearly in the Mountain West, as are many of the other states which are doing a little bit better, nothing to brag about. One of the things about Montana that is so frustrating for this recession is that we had been doing a lot better. When you look at the measure we like to use of the economy, and this is annual data from the BEA, non-farm income, our growth had picked up considerably from 2018. That is not a missing point in 2016. That was a zero growth, required a special session of the legislature. It was a great idea using my phone as a timekeeper until it blanked out. Sorry about that. One of the things that we're realizing in Montana is that really there are no special stories as you go around our state in terms of what happened. So when you look at the job declines, which is the darker bar, and the wage declines, the lighter bar, and these are our larger communities across the state, there are shades of gray differences between these, but there really is no outlier. Every one of the urban areas of our state suffered greatly in terms of jobs, did not suffer quite as much in terms of wages. This includes areas which had been growing very, very rapidly, like Gallatin County near Yellowstone Park, and areas that were on much more of a sedate trajectory. All of those areas have lost, and there's really no special story about any of them, even though they're all quite different in terms of the industry mix. So what's happened since this low point is a little less certain in Montana. I get in some trouble when I say this, but I'll say this from experience. As our experience in a state our size, the current the CES data from the establishment survey tend to be a little less reliable. The revisions tend to really change the story a lot, but nonetheless, they are current through November, obviously through December for the US, but we don't have Montana yet. And so here's a little, I would say a tentative picture, because I'm not quite sure the data have firmed up, but nonetheless, it appears with the CES data that the story is the same in the sense that we didn't quite fall as far, but my God, what a fall in employment. And there has been a pretty impressive recovery, which has not taken us all the way back. That's the story we're hearing in state after state. It's not different here. The other part of the story, of course, is the slowdown in terms of speed of the recovery, with the U.S. actually, as everyone knows, actually suffering a mild net job decline in December. And Montana, we're also in that same page. So what do we know going forward? Well, we think we're doing a little better than other states, but what does it really mean? Here is a look from tracktorecovery.org. And the point of this graph, if you can see it, is it also agrees the other states' experience in terms of this measure of employment is something that the other states are in those little gray lines, which you can just barely see. And we're not leading, but we're towards the upper echelon of states in terms of how we're performing. That certainly agrees with that. So, really to go much deeper than that, we really need to go into all the details of the Montana economy. And of course, I love to do that, but there's probably not time. But let me give you a little flavor of that by looking at some of the things we talk about. So we're a very large and diverse state, geographically speaking. And one of the things we do worry about is what's going on with the oil industry, and our North Dakota friends have a huge stake in that as well. You can see the free fall in production that occurred in 2020 during that price event that was mentioned for North Dakota in terms of what happened to the prices. Prices are still not up to where they were before, as everyone knows. And this slowdown, which has been very erratic in Bakken production, is going to impact Montana. Montana is the largest business center adjacent, especially from Billings and points east of Montana. And we will feel that pain significantly, particularly regarding Wyoming as well, which I know is not part of this conference, but is very closely linked to what happens in Montana, especially in the eastern part of the state. So that's certainly something to watch, and we're quite concerned about that. Our South Dakota colleagues talked about what was going on in travel and tourism with respect to park attendance. We've seen that as well. Campgrounds and parks were relatively busy this summer, but it's not the same. I mean, the Canadian border is closed. International travel is basically halted. People are driving to get here, and what do they do when they get here? They don't spend as much money. So yes, the roads are full of out-of-state license plates, as they are every summer in this part of the world. But you notice this data from tracktorecovery.org says that restaurant and hotel spending down 41% from where we were before. That's certainly being felt by those.
Hello, it looks like we might have had some technical difficulties with Pat. We are going to work on those if as we can. I think what I'm going to do in the interim, if Mark and Jeremy were willing to join us a little bit early in the Q&A, we will finish Pat's remarks if we can get him back up. But I think in the meantime, let's transition to some of the Q&A. And I'm wondering, Mark and Jeremy, if you two would be willing to give me your thoughts kind of on the employment trend. Right now what we're seeing is that it sounds like there are lots of jobs out there, but we're not seeing employment react in a very aggressive trajectory, especially of late in many states. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about kind of the employment trend and maybe the mismatch between, we know that there's a lot of companies that are hiring. We're seeing a little bit less enthusiasm in the labor market in terms of taking those jobs. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind, could you start us?
Yeah, sure, Ron. That's a great question, and I appreciate it. I think, we had that really strong recovery, and it was hard for us, in my day job, I model the economy for the revenues here in South Dakota. And so it's hard for us to understand what was going to happen going forward. And I think, what we're looking at here is families made decisions about, a parent staying home to take care of the children, to keep them out of higher risk situations. And I think, individuals that have made the choice to leave the workforce. And so what we're really looking to is vaccine utilization and how quickly that can happen. In South Dakota here, we're rolling it out really quickly. I think we're number 2 now behind North Dakota. And that's going to be an important metric for us to get that out. And we're hopeful that once we get widespread vaccine utilization, we'll start to reverse some of those trends, with parents leaving the workforce and individuals waiting until, they feel comfortable coming back to work. So,
great. Jeremy, your thoughts on that?
Sure. So North Dakota is in kind of an interesting place in that to a certain degree, there was mismatch before the pandemic in the sense that we just have so many job openings that were unfilled before we had the pandemic situation. And a lot of the job losses that we experienced followed many of the same trends in the other states, but there was a little bit of a unique factor in our state in that our economy, as I talked about, has a lot to do with the energy sector and mining and logging as an industry. Mostly that's all oil extraction. Is by far the piece of our employment that suffered the most. And so the western side of the state, the side closest to Montana, is where the unemployment rates have been the highest. On the eastern side, it's a completely different picture in terms of the largest the largest unemployment is in, of course, our hospitality and leisure categories. So it's a very, different perspective from different sides of the state. Are
you looking up some data, Jeremy?
Oh.
Or were you done? Okay, great. Okay, so I am curious. The speakers in our first leg of the conference talked about disparities in terms of impact, and we know, at least from the macro data, that the pandemic's impact has really fallen disproportionately hard on minority workers, women, low-income jobs, and also small firms. And I'm wondering if the two of you might give me a little bit more sense whether or not you are seeing those similar impacts in the Dakotas. I know the Dakotas industry mix is a little bit different, especially with dependence on energy. I'm just curious whether or not you're seeing the same kinds of disparate impact on different populations. Jeremy, how about you go first on this one?
Sure. So North Dakota, again, is somewhat different from the experience of other states, partly that our state is not particularly that diverse. So we don't have a lot of different racial groups that are present in many of the other states in larger quantities. But again, the industries that have been hit hardest are often going to be the ones that I do believe have been ones that have been occupied by many of our immigrant populations. So they are feeling the impacts, especially in some of the hospitality industries and places where some of our immigrant populations are entrepreneurs and have private businesses that are struggling.
Okay, Mark, thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I would say, in South Dakota, we're seeing very similar trends. Our minority populations, which are predominantly immigrants, and then our large Native American population here in South Dakota, and then women are lagging. Those are all areas where employment lagged before the pandemic started, and we saw more pronounced impacts on them. Since then, we're continuing to keep an eye on that as we recover, and we're hopeful that we can start to, work towards equity on those areas. So,
okay. Great, thank you both. You highlighted the recent growth, or the continued growth really, of healthcare in the state. And I'm curious what you know, or what you might tell us about the outlook in healthcare employment. And I think in particular, in relation to the difficulty of many of those jobs in that sector right now, and probably particularly on those frontline workers. You know, I hear reports, of nursing burnout with many personnel that have had to deal with this COVID surge, with long hours and risk and exposure and things like that. I'm wondering if you can tell me where you think that job mismatch that we might already be seeing, where you think it might be going given these circumstances.
That's a difficult one in South Dakota in particular, because we had, there's a lot of openings like I talked about, but we've got a lot of need for that. The ruralness of the state makes it so that, we probably need a disproportionate amount of healthcare workers in terms of our population, just so that we do have service to all the rural parts of the state. We've worked on creating efficiencies in terms of telehealth and e-healthcare that we've done. And so, the governor took some steps at the start of the pandemic that I think we're looking to make more permanent, to make it easier to have that continue going forward. As far as, where those job mismatches are occurring, you're right. I mean, it's concerning. We hear the same things about burnout, and those are individuals that we've devoted a lot of resources in the state in terms of, scholarships or incentive programs that we have to get those people to serve in the healthcare field. And so we don't want to have any mismatch occurring. Not really any information yet on where they're going or what's happening if they're leaving the state or if they're leaving that sector of the workforce. But it's something we'll keep an eye on as it'll become, pressing, as it's been pressing for us. We saw, we were thinking maybe the wage growth that we were seeing, or the posted wages that we were seeing, was maybe related to that, trying to keep people in the workforce or attract more people to it. But, it'll be something that we'll have to monitor going forward, because those are skilled workers that we need to keep there.
Right. So Pat Barkey used a turn of phrase that I thought was in a useful crystallization of some of the issues here. And he said it's more of a jobs recession than a wage recession, where there's been a lot of loss in lower wage jobs, and it really hasn't had a terribly significant impact on the total wage picture. I think some might spin that as good news. I think some, including me, would spin it more as bad news, in that, in terms of I think some of the populations that were finally starting to see some wage traction and job traction before the pandemic, now is that population being impacted? And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how we continue to pay attention to those that have been impacted the most. Mark, I think you're up first on this one.
That's a good question. I mean, here in South Dakota, I think the governor, she's fairly well known as of late about providing opportunities for all and pushing that. And we she recently announced a private and state partnership of where a $100 million donation for scholarships for needs-based scholarships is coming in, and she challenged the state to match $50 million, and then we're looking for another $50 million from other private donors. So trying to create a $200 million trust fund to pay for needs-based scholarships. And I think that that's going to be important looking forward, is how do we educate people at the bottom that have the greatest need and create some stability for them going forward.
Jeremy, any additional thoughts on that point?
Well, I think you're exactly right that the thing about the pandemic is that it's hitting those who were struggling before the pandemic the most. So those are truly the people who were suffering before, and now the suffering is even greater. But it is it is a hard problem to fix, in that we had that problem beforehand. And again, the part of the issue is these industries like the retail industry. Several of these industries are the ones that have been hit really hard, where a lot of people, especially some of our job openings for those who have lower levels of education, et cetera, are really the ones that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic.
Right. So it looks like Pat has joined us on the phone. Pat, so sorry to hear about your technical issues. These things happen. I'm really glad that you were able to join us. I was just mentioning to our other panelists, the comment that you made that I thought was really interesting is that this is a jobs recession and not a wage recession. And what I was asking our other panelists, Mark and Jeremy, was, how we, before the pandemic, it really looked like we were finally starting to see some traction on the lower end of the pay scale, and bringing more people into the labor force. And now it seems like we've kind of pulled the plug on that. And I'm wondering if you just had any other thoughts on how we might hopefully start, kind of restart that momentum that we had going before the pandemic hit.
Sure, and thanks, Ron. Sorry for the problems. Well, I think first and foremost we have to and get out of the social distancing. We have to get into a public health situation where we can once again meet and greet each other without fear of mortal consequences. So that's clearly part of it. I think, however, that this recession, like every other recession we've ever experienced, is bringing out changes which will be permanent. And unfortunately, on those transitions between pre and post, there's going to be people that are going to get hurt, and it's a shame. But I think what is going to help and could help very quickly is getting into a situation, for example, for a state like Montana, where the travel industry is back open, where our border with Canada is back open, and where some of the ordinary interactions that we've enjoyed can happen again. We've done a lot of that already, and we need to do more. So, from a policy point of view, how do you implement that? Well, I mean, quite honestly, we just have to have our bureaucracy work a little better. I think that's our perspective. I think the advances in science have been impressive, and now we just need to get the next stage of our public health corrections underway and start vaccinating people.
Right. So I'm wondering if, Pat, I'm going to start with you on this, just to give you a little more airtime. I'm wondering if you've seen any new sprigs of growth that have kind of gotten a jump start expressly from the pandemic, that might fuel future growth. It seems like the pandemic has accelerated lots of tendencies. And I'm wondering if you see anything in the data yet about with certain sectors or other things, maybe conversations with entrepreneurs about what this might be sparking as fuel for a faster pace of growth going forward.
Well, I'll tell you, there's two groups. I mean, there's the things which I think are not specific to Montana, but they're everywhere. I think the performance of the tech industry specifically and the performance of technology overall in every industry has been a source of inspiration, maybe a little frustration like I just had a few minutes ago, right? But nonetheless, it's been a productivity booster. There's going to be no going back. I mean, my father-in-law buys his groceries online. That's incredible to me. I mean, that's an adoption rate I never thought I would see happen. Very specifically to Montana, though, one of the things that there really is an open question, I'm skeptical about it, but I'd be interested in what others think, and that is this notion that we are going to see some sort of change in our urbanization patterns. I'll tell you, the housing market, the construction, existing home markets are booming here, and even commercial real estate a little bit, while that one is more troubled. There's been no hiccup. Yeah, you can observe that from what's going on with lumber prices. They're heading right back up again. It's big demand, short supply. That's a familiar story in some of the more unaffordable areas, as our western part of our state is starting to become. But I think housing and this notion of whether or not Manhattanites really need to be in Manhattan, and of course they don't, but will they move to Montana? Is that even realistic? I think that one is potentially could be a game changer, although, as I said before, I'm a little bit skeptical about it, but nonetheless, the reaction of markets in a time of extraordinary economic upheaval has been a huge surprise.
Jeremy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the one of the things that was just brought up with the advent of being able to work from so many different locations, it does have an interesting aspect with our labor market struggles in our own state, especially if our firms are able to hire people that don't actually live here. But again, you miss out on other aspects too. I think so many people have also had this experience that yes, we can work at a distance. But there's clearly some things that happen from that face-to-face contact. And I think that we're also seeing some of the value of maybe what we had neglected before, and to see the value of actually interacting with people passing in the hallways and that type of communication that happens. So I don't foresee that as necessarily being the big replacer for us. And you know, North Dakota is a great place to live. We need more people to move here. We've got jobs, and as Governor Burgum was pointing out, we do have a very ag focused economy, but the ties between tech and ag are really getting strong, and we have lots of tech jobs that are open.
Thank you, Jeremy. Mark?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback onto what both Pat and Jeremy mentioned, the change, in where people live. We're seeing home construction here really go through the roof in South Dakota. We're getting anecdotal evidence that there are people coming up and snapping up homes that are from outside of state, and we're starting to see people that have moved here. And so we're trying to capitalize on that with some large investments in broadband, so that, as these people are planning to work remotely and use the internet, that they have reliable internet there for them. And so, that's something that we're hopeful for, and we'll keep an eye on, and hopefully just increase our workforce overall and really be able to stimulate growth in the state.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Really interesting. So I think maybe time for one or two more questions. This matter was brought up in the first session about automation. And I'm curious, for example, Mark, I noticed in your slide deck in terms of job postings, and I think we're all familiar, there's a lot of jobs in transportation and distribution. We're an online buying society. We're moving more towards that. Lots of jobs in that warehouse and driver kind of area. It also seems to me to be an area kind of ripe for automation and job loss eventually. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that kind of that tension between trying to grow and get people into sustainable jobs, sustainable occupations and industries, and the trade-off between, look, we kind of need people to work now, for income and things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit just about that tension?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point in from a rural state and agriculture state. I'll answer it from that perspective. When we look at some of the automation that's occurring in that distribution in those chains, they're looking further, they're looking at more urban areas, from port to warehouse, or from warehouse to distribution center, and that's not really what the focus of that industry in South Dakota is. It's really based on the ag economy, and I think it gets more difficult to automate that part of it in South Dakota when we're talking about moving pigs or cattle from some field to a feedlot or something like that. When we're talking about moving grain from the field to either the farmers' silos or to the local granary. And so obviously there is opportunity for that to occur in South Dakota, and you always want to weigh the needs of now versus the needs of the future. And so we always just look to just educate our workforce for the future. That's something to build South Dakota programs that we have, and that's something that we're really focused on. So
great. Pat, what do you think on that matter?
Well, certainly, I mean, it's hard to remember this, but we were just recently, particularly in this part of the country, in an extraordinarily tight labor market situation, which was already moving us in that direction. Obviously, the pandemic is a big monkey wrench in all of that, but it has definitely spurred, as I said, the adoption rates of technology. I guess I see that more generally, not automation as specifically, but more generally the adoption of technology. We're not going to go back, be it in higher ed, manufacturing, or even government, is going to be embracing technology much more. Is that automation? I think probably it is. I think many times the use of that term is kind of implied that there's this big squeeze on the demand for labor, automation destroying jobs and so forth. I like to think about that. While I recognize that, I definitely do. I like to think of it as well as freeing up resources for other goods and services. I think we've certainly seen that. I think in this era of where we are today, that we see that examples of that all over the place, and there are many nimble businesses in Montana and throughout the district that are taking advantage of new demands for new kinds of products and services, including support for Zoom calls, retooling government operations, DMV lines. The governor mentioned that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily all bad in terms of labor demand, I would argue.
Right. And that kind of upbeat note, I think, is maybe a good place for us to close our discussion. I really want to give I wish we had the hundreds of people that attended today, that they could all clap for you, because this has just been a really wonderful session. Thank you to Mark and Jeremy and Pat for bringing really a wealth of information and knowledge to our audience. And I also want to thank special thanks to Governor Burgum, all of our state specialists who came here today to share their insights, and to everybody in attendance today. We hope you found it a worthwhile investment of your time. There's been an awful lot of information shared. As we've noted, the PowerPoints and the conference video will be available fairly soon. And the best part of it is we're going to deliver it. If you've registered and you're online here, we're going to deliver it right to your email. So you can look for that. One final thing before we close, we would greatly appreciate feedback from attendees on this conference. It's annual, so we're always looking to improve. We don't know that it will be exactly in this format, but we do expect to do virtual from now on, hopefully with also an in-person function. But when you leave today, please hit the red box that says leave or leave meeting. And this will take you to a very short survey that will allow you to give us some feedback for next year. With that, again, I want to say one more time, thanks to everyone involved today. We appreciate your time and attention, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. This conference is now closed.